It still freaks me out to this day, you know. Even thinking about it, I get this weird tightness in my chest, like when you're waiting for bad news. I don't usually talk about it, because who would believe it, right? People look at you like you've grown a second head. My buddies from that trip, we mention it sometimes, sort of in hushed tones, like it's some kind of pact we made. This weird thing that happened that no one else gets. It was supposed to be a fun weekend. Ski trip to Vermont. Me, Dave, Sarah, and Jess. We'd been planning it for weeks. Packed the car with skis, snowboards, bags of chips, all the usual road trip crap. We were all hyped, blasting music, making jokes. It was a Friday night, late-ish, maybe around 10 p.m., something like that. We were driving up I-91, pretty far north by then. Definitely past any big towns. Just stretches of highway, woods on either side, the kind of place where you see deer crossing signs every mile and your cell service starts to get spotty. It was dark, like really dark. No moon that night, just stars if you looked up, but mostly you just saw the road in front of you lit up by the headlights. We were talking about something stupid, probably complaining about work or something, when it happened. Just out of nowhere. I was driving, doing maybe 65, 70, just keeping pace with traffic. Dave was shotgun, messing with the radio. Sarah and Jess were in the back, probably on their phones, honestly. Then, in the headlights, I saw something move. Fast. From the right side of the road, the woods side. At first I thought it was a deer, you know? They're always jumping out. But this was wrong. Too big. Too upright. It came crashing out of the trees, and I mean crashing, branches snapping, leaves flying, and it was across the shoulder of the road in like a split second. It was already moving into my lane, the right lane. I slammed on the brakes. My heart jumped into my throat. "Whoa, what the hell?" I yelled, and I yanked the wheel to the left hard. I remember the tires screeching, the car swerving. For a second, I thought we were going to lose control, spin out. But it wasn't a deer. It wasn't any animal I've ever seen. It was huge, taller than a person, way taller, and hairy, covered in dark hair, thick, matted-looking hair. It was shaped like a man in a way, you know, 2 legs, 2 arms, head on top, but everything was just wrong, massive, muscular but not in a human way, like bulky all over, and the arms, they looked long, way too long for a normal person. It was running, no, not running, more like loping this weird, powerful stride, and it just burst onto the highway and then stopped, just froze, right in the middle of the road in both lanes about halfway across, facing away from us, towards the other side of the highway, and it raised its arms, straight up in the air, above its head, both arms stiff as boards, like it was surrendering or worshipping something. I don't know. But it just stood there, frozen solid, arms up, in this completely unnatural pose, in the middle of the highway at night. My brain was short-circuiting. I swerved around it, clipping past it in the left lane. I could feel my heart pounding like it was trying to escape my chest. Everyone in the car was yelling. "What was that?" Dave shouted, twisting around to look out the back window. "Jesus Christ, Mark, what was that thing?" Sarah was practically screaming from the back seat. Jess was just making these choked sounds, like she couldn't even get words out. I was still trying to get my breath back, hands shaking on the wheel. I don't know, I managed to say. "I swear to God, I have no idea what that was." I glanced in the rearview mirror. It was just gone, vanished, like it had never been there, but I knew I saw it. We all saw it, this thing. We drove in silence for a few minutes. Nobody said a word. The music was still playing softly from the radio, some upbeat song that felt totally out of place now. The excitement from earlier was just gone, replaced by this cold, heavy feeling. "Did anyone else see that?" I finally asked, my voice still shaky. "See it? Mark, I almost had a heart attack," Dave said, turning back around. "What the hell was that? It looked like Bigfoot or something." He tried to laugh, but it sounded forced, nervous. "It was huge," Sarah said, her voice still trembling. And those arms, what was it doing with its arms? Jess still hadn't said anything. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was pale, staring straight ahead, her eyes wide. I don't know, I said again. It was just standing there like a tree, but alive and hairy, so hairy. We kept driving, trying to talk about something else, anything else, but it was hard. That image, that thing, was just stuck in my head. Those long arms raised up, the way it stood there, so still, so silent. It was just wrong, deeply wrong. Then, about a mile or two down the road, the car started to sputter. Just a little cough at first, then a bigger one. The engine started losing power. The headlights flickered. "Uh-oh," Dave said. "What's going on?" I pressed on the gas, but the car just jerked and slowed down. "Something's wrong," I said, fighting to keep the car moving. "I think we're losing power." The engine coughed again, louder this time, and the car started to shake. We were losing speed fast. I managed to pull over to the shoulder, the car groaning and shuddering to a stop. The engine died completely. Silence, except for the wind whistling past the car. I tried to start it again. Nothing, not even a click. Dead. "Great," Dave said. "Just great." He sounded more resigned than angry. "What now?" Sarah asked from the back. I got out of the car, popped the hood. Not that I'm a mechanic or anything, but maybe I could see something obvious. It was pitch black under the hood. I fumbled for my phone to use the flashlight. "Anyone have cell service?" I asked, shining the phone light into the engine compartment. "Just a mess of wires and hoses to me." "Nope," Dave said, holding up his phone. "Nothing." Sarah and Jess shook their heads. "Dead zones everywhere out here." "Terrific," I muttered. "We're stranded, in the middle of nowhere, at night." "Maybe we can walk to a town," Sarah suggested, trying to sound positive, but I could hear the worry in her voice. I looked around, just woods on both sides of the highway. "I don't see any towns," I said. "Not around here. Remember that last exit? Willowbrook? Maybe that was a town." Dave looked at his phone, which still had no service, but the GPS was working. "Yeah, Willowbrook exit. Says it's about a mile back." A mile. That's not far, right? But a mile in the dark, on the side of a highway, in the middle of nowhere, Vermont. And after what we just saw, the thought of that thing popped back into my head. Had it followed us? Was it still out there? "Let's just walk to Willowbrook," I said, trying to sound confident, even though I was feeling anything but. "Maybe there's a gas station, a motel, something." We got our bags out of the trunk. It was cold out now, really cold. I zipped up my jacket, wished I'd worn warmer shoes. We started walking back down the highway towards Willowbrook. The highway was deserted, not another car in sight. Just us, walking on the dark shoulder, the wind blowing, the trees whispering in the dark. Every rustle in the woods, every shadow, made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see what? That thing again. I didn't know. But the feeling of unease, the sense of being watched, was getting stronger with every step. It felt like it took forever to walk that mile. Finally, we saw a sign for Willowbrook. Then, a little further on, we saw lights in the distance. Buildings, a real town. Relief flooded through me. Willowbrook was tiny. Just a few streets, a gas station that was closed, a general store that looked shut down, and a motel. The Willowbrook Motel. Faded neon sign, peeling paint, but it was open. Lights on in the office. We went inside. The guy behind the counter was this older dude, kind of scruffy looking, with tired eyes. He looked up as we came in. "Car trouble," I said, trying to smile. "We broke down on the highway." "Figures," he said without much interest. "Highway's cursed tonight." Cursed. What did he mean by that? I ignored it. "Got any rooms available?" I asked. "Yeah, got a few," he said. "Take your pick. Number 7's open. Got 2 double beds." "Number 7? Okay." We were too tired to argue. We just needed a place to sleep. We paid him, got the key, and went to find room 7. It was on the ground floor, at the end of a long, dimly lit corridor. The room was basic. Old beds, worn carpet, musty smell. But it was warm, and it was inside. We dumped our bags on the floor, flopped onto the beds. Thank God, Sarah sighed. A bed. I'm exhausted. Me too, Jess whispered, still looking pale. She sat on the edge of the bed, not moving. Dave was pacing around the room, looking out the window. Still can't believe what we saw, he said, shaking his head. Seriously, what was that thing? We talked about it for a while, going over every detail, trying to make sense of it. Was it a bear? Too big? Too upright? Too hairy? A moose? Definitely not a moose. A person in a costume? Out in the middle of nowhere? At night? And why would they just stand there, in that weird pose? The more we talked about it, the less sense it made, and the more unsettled I felt. We were safe now, inside, in a room, in a town. But Willowbrook. It was a mile back to where we saw it. Just a mile. That didn't feel like enough distance. I couldn't shake this feeling of dread, like something was still out there, watching us, waiting. We tried to sleep, but it was hard. The motel was quiet, too quiet. You could hear every creak, every sigh of the old building. I kept thinking about that thing standing in the road, those arms raised, that silent, frozen pose. Sometime in the middle of the night I woke up. I don't know what woke me. Maybe a sound, maybe just a feeling. But I was awake, and the room was cold, colder than it should have been. I sat up in bed, listening. Everything was silent, too silent. Even the wind outside seemed to have died down. And then I heard it, a sound, faint at first, almost like I was imagining it. But it was there, a soft rustling. Outside the window, I held my breath, listening harder. The rustling got louder, closer, like something was moving through the bushes outside our room, stepping on twigs, brushing against leaves. My heart started to race again. I sat frozen in bed, staring at the window. It was dark outside, black as ink. I couldn't see anything through the glass, just my own reflection, pale and scared. The rustling kept coming closer. It sounded like something big, something heavy, moving slowly, deliberately. I wanted to wake Dave, Sarah, Jess, but I was too scared to move, too scared to make a sound. I just sat there listening, my blood running cold. The rustling stopped right outside the window. Silence again. But this time, it wasn't peaceful silence. It was waiting silence, heavy, thick with something unseen. And then I heard it again. Closer now, right outside the window, a sound, like breathing, but not human breathing, deeper, raspier, heavier, animalistic. My breath hitched in my throat. I could feel my skin crawling. Whatever was outside, it was right there, just on the other side of the wall. I lay there, frozen, listening to that heavy breathing, listening to the silence around it, the darkness pressing in. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what it was. But I knew, with every fiber of my being, that it was connected to what we'd seen on the highway. That thing. The breathing went on for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, gradually, it faded away. The rustling started again, moving away from the window, back into the woods, until finally there was just silence again. But the silence was different now. It was empty, as if something had been there, and now it was gone. But the feeling, the cold dread, lingered. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound, waiting for the sun to come up, waiting for the night to be over. In the morning, we got out of Willowbrook as fast as we could. Got a tow truck to come for the car, skipped the skiing trip entirely. We just wanted to get home, back to normal. Back to where things made sense. We've told people about it a few times. Friends, family, colleagues. They just laugh. Bigfoot in Vermont, come on guys. You were probably just tired. Imagination running wild. They don't get it. They weren't there. They didn't see it. They didn't feel that cold dread in the middle of the night in Willowbrook. I still don't know what it was. I still can't explain it. Was it real? Did we really see it? Or was it some kind of hallucination? Some shared delusion? But I know what I saw. We all do. And I know I'll never forget it. That figure in the headlights, those arms raised in the night, the silence, and the feeling, that chilling, bone-deep feeling of something other, something we don't understand, something that maybe shouldn't be understood. And sometimes, late at night when it's really quiet, I still think I hear that breathing, faint, far away. But there, and I remember Willowbrook, and I wonder, is it still out there, watching, waiting? I don't know. And that's the part that really freaks me out. Not knowing, never knowing. Story 2. It's still crystal clear in my head, like it happened yesterday, even though it was years ago, back in 2008. We were young, dumb, and thought we were invincible, you know? Me, Jerome, and the Hanson twins, Austin and Alex. We'd grown up together in Alpine Valley, Utah, practically lived outdoors during the summers. This particular summer was right before Jerome was heading off on his mission, and he wanted one last proper adventure before disappearing for 2 years. So, Black Canyon, Wasatch Mountains it was. Felt like the perfect send-off. We planned it for a Friday in June, figured we could hike in Friday afternoon, camp out near Shadow Lake, do some fishing, classic stuff. Looking back, Friday the 13th would have been fitting, you know, with how things went. Anyway, we got to the trailhead, packed up our gear, tents, sleeping bags, fishing rods, the usual camping stuff. The hike in wasn't too bad, maybe a couple of hours, but it was uphill pretty much the whole way, getting steeper as we got closer to the lake. When we finally reached Shadow Lake, it was gorgeous, just like in the pictures. Deep blue water surrounded by these huge, jagged peaks, and the woods were thick with pines and aspens. We found a decent spot to set up camp a little north of the lake, kind of tucked away but still close enough to the water. The afternoon was perfect. Sunny, not too hot, a slight breeze. We spent hours fishing in the lake, just chilling, catching up, you know, typical guy stuff. We weren't having much luck with the fishing, actually, but honestly, just being out there away from everything was enough. As the afternoon started to fade and dusk began to settle, Austin was messing around with getting a campfire going. He's always been the fire starter of the group. Alex and I were cleaning the few trout we'd managed to catch, getting them ready to cook later. That's when Austin kind of froze, staring off into the woods behind our campsite. I remember I asked him, "What's up?" And he just sort of waved his hand dismissively like, "Nothing, just thought I saw something." He went back to arranging the kindling, but I could tell something had spooked him a little. I didn't push it, figured it was just deer or something. Black Canyon is full of wildlife. We got the fire going pretty soon after that, and the light from the flames felt good as the shadows started to deepen around us. We cooked the fish over the fire, ate them with some ramen we'd brought, nothing fancy, but it tasted amazing out there. We were talking about stupid stuff, laughing, reminiscing about all the dumb things we'd done growing up, just enjoying the last bit of daylight. That's when we started hearing it. At first, it was really faint, almost like the wind whistling through the trees, but different. It was more melodic, like an actual whistle, not like a person whistling a tune, but something else. I looked at Austin, and he looked back at me, and I could see in his eyes he'd heard it too. Alex, who was usually oblivious to everything, finally stopped talking mid-sentence and said, "Did you guys hear that?" We all went quiet, listening. The whistling was still there, fainter now, and seemed to be coming from further off in the woods. We figured it was probably just some weird bird call we'd never heard before. We're not exactly wildlife experts. We laughed it off, chalked it up to being out in the wilderness, and went back to our conversation. But then it started again, this time louder and closer, and it wasn't just the whistling anymore. There was this smell, kind of musky, animalistic, but also weirdly Off, like something rotting but not quite. Hard to describe even now. It just didn't smell natural. It cut through the pine smell of the forest, making my nose wrinkle. It wasn't overpowering, just this underlying stink that was really unsettling. And with the smell and the whistling getting closer came this feeling. It's hard to put into words, like we were being watched. Not just watched, but scrutinized. Like something out there was studying us, sizing us up. It was this heavy, oppressive feeling that settled over the campsite. The kind of feeling that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I remember looking around, trying to pinpoint where the smell and the sound were coming from. The fire was crackling, casting flickering shadows that danced across the trees surrounding our camp. Everything outside the firelight seemed so much darker, more menacing. The woods just seemed to swallow up the light, and the whistling kept getting closer, circling around our campsite, it seemed. It was no bird. Definitely not a bird. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. The conversation died down again. We were all listening now, trying to make sense of what was happening. Nobody said anything for a long minute, maybe more. The only sounds were the crackling fire, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, and that damned whistling. And that smell. It was faint, but definitely there, lingering in the air. Then Jerome, being Jerome, said, a little too loudly, trying to sound braver than I think he actually felt, "Maybe it's a bear or a mountain lion. You guys packed the bear spray, right?" Austin nodded, pointing to the canister lying near his backpack. "Yeah, got it. But bears don't whistle, do they?" He said it as a question, but his voice was tight. He was clearly starting to get spooked, too. "Mountain lions scream, right?" Alex chimed in, his voice sounding higher pitched than usual. "Like a really loud scream?" "Yeah," I said. "They do, and that ain't no scream." My heart was starting to beat faster now. This was going beyond just being a bit creepy. This was actively unnerving. I didn't see them then. Mark told me about it later after the lake thing and showed me the photos. They looked similar to how I imagined the big creature's foot might look. Just gigantic. I don't know what I saw that day. I honestly don't. And I still don't understand any of it. The footprints, the howls, the broken trees. It all adds up to something, but something I can't name. Something that scares the hell out of me. I still live here. I'm still on this land. But I'm not the same. I don't sit on the porch and relax like I used to. I always have one eye on the lake, watching the reeds, listening for sounds in the woods. Every shadow looks a little darker. Every rustle of leaves sounds a little louder. And at night, the nights are the worst, when it's quiet and you can hear the wind in the trees. And sometimes I think I hear those howls again, faint and far off, but there. Just a reminder that there's something out there, something big, something hairy, something unknown. And I saw it. I really saw it. And I can't explain it. And that's the part that really messes with you, you know. Not understanding, just not knowing, and knowing that something other is out there, still out there. The whistling was closer still. It was like it was moving around the edge of our campsite, just outside the ring of firelight. It would get louder as it moved closer, then fade a bit as it moved away. But it was definitely circling us. And the smell. It was getting stronger, more pungent, more feral. Then nature called. I needed to pee. Stupid, right? In that situation, my body decides now is a good time to empty my bladder, but I couldn't hold it any longer. I really didn't want to leave the firelight, didn't want to step out into the darkness, not with whatever the hell was making that whistling sound lurking around. But what was I going to do? Pee in the fire. Just gonna go take a leak, I mumbled, trying to sound casual, but I'm pretty sure my voice was shaking a little. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack, switched it on, and tried to act like I wasn't completely terrified. I walked a little ways from the fire, just past the edge of the clearing, towards the trees, keeping the flashlight beam moving, scanning the shadows. "Don't go too far," Austin called out, his voice tight. Yeah, just right here, I replied, trying to sound confident. My heart was hammering in my chest. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. The shadows seemed to be alive, shifting and moving even when there was no wind. I found a spot behind a couple of big pine trees, maybe 40 yards or so from the campsite. I thought that was far enough, but not too far to lose sight of the firelight completely. I unzipped my pants, pointed myself towards a tree, and stopped. Because I saw it. Between those two pine trees, standing just inside the edge of the woods, was something. A figure. Tall, massive, shadowy, but definitely there. It was hard to make out details in the dark, even with the flashlight, but I could see the outline. It was easily 7 feet tall, maybe more, and wide, broader than any man I'd ever seen. It was just there, standing perfectly still, watching me. I froze, completely paralyzed. My flashlight beam was shaking wildly, bouncing around the trees, but I kept it pointed roughly in the direction of the figure. I couldn't breathe. My mind went blank. All I could do was stare. It didn't move, just stood there, a hulking dark shape against the darker background of the trees. The whistling stopped. Everything went silent, except for the crackling of the campfire behind me and the frantic pounding of my own heart. Then snap! A sharp, loud crack like a branch breaking, but not far away. Close, too close. Closer than the figure. It sounded like it was right at the edge of the trees, maybe only 20 yards from me, maybe less. It was definitely coming from the woods, directly in front of me, between me and the figure. And then it stepped out. Not the shadowy figure I'd seen between the trees. Something else. Something real. Something solid. Something impossibly huge. It emerged from the trees in the space between me and the shadowy figure, stepping into a small patch of moonlight that filtered through the leaves. And in that brief flash of moonlight I saw it clearly. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. It was real, and it was standing right there. 7 feet? No, more like 7.5, 8 feet easy, covered in thick dark fur, massive shoulders, long arms that hung down past its knees. And the face, oh God, the face. I only saw it for a split second in the moonlight, but it's burned into my brain forever. Flat, broad nose, heavy brow ridge, deep-set eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. And those eyes, they were fixed on me, piercing, intelligent, and predatory. Fear, pure, raw, primal terror. It hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air out of my lungs. I don't think I've ever felt fear like that before or since. It was beyond anything I could have imagined. My legs turned to jelly. My bladder decided to cooperate after all, but not in the way I intended. I screamed. Not a manly scream, not a brave scream, just a high-pitched, animalistic shriek of pure terror. And then I turned and ran. I ran like my life depended on it because I honestly thought it did. I didn't even think about the shadowy figure still standing back in the trees. I just ran straight back towards the campfire, towards the light, towards my friends, yelling, "Sasquatch! Sasquatch! It's a Sasquatch!" over and over again like a crazy person. I burst back into the campsite, tripping over a log, stumbling, scrambling to my feet, my heart pounding like a drum in my ears. Austin and Alex were staring at me, wide-eyed, mouths open. They could see the terror on my face. They could hear it in my voice. "What? What is it?" Austin shouted, jumping to his feet. "Sasquatch!" I gasped, pointing back towards the woods. "Bigfoot! I saw it! It's out there! It was huge! Oh God, it was huge!" They looked at each other, then back at me, disbelief mixed with growing fear in their eyes. They could tell I wasn't joking. They knew me too well to think I'd make something like this up. And then Austin said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I saw something earlier, when I was starting the fire, back there, in the trees." He pointed to the same direction I'd come running from. I thought it was just shadows, but it was big. Suddenly, it all clicked. The whistling, the smell, the feeling of being watched, Austin's earlier sighting, it all made horrifying sense. We weren't just imagining things. We weren't just spooked by the dark. There was something out there, something real, something massive and unknown and dangerous. Without another word, without even thinking about it, we started throwing our gear back into our backpacks, ripping down the tent, stuffing sleeping bags, grabbing anything and everything, not caring if we were being neat or organized, just wanting to pack up and get the hell out of there as fast as humanly possible. We didn't even put out the fire properly, just kicked dirt and rocks on it until the flames were mostly smothered. We didn't care about leaving no trace or any of that responsible camping crap. All we cared about was getting away, getting out of those woods, getting back to civilization, getting back to safety. We didn't speak as we packed, just moved in a frantic, silent frenzy, fueled by adrenaline and terror. We didn't need to discuss it, didn't need to make a plan. We all knew we were leaving, now, and not coming back. We hoisted our packs onto our backs, the weight feeling heavier than usual, fear adding physical pounds to our gear. I grabbed my flashlight again, and Austin grabbed the bear spray, holding it ready in his hand. Alex just trailed behind us, pale and silent, his eyes wide with fear. We started hiking back down the trail, stumbling in the darkness, the beams of our flashlights bouncing wildly ahead of us. We didn't run, not exactly. We moved quickly, desperately, but also trying to be as quiet as possible, not wanting to draw attention to ourselves. But in the panic and darkness, we still crashed and stumbled plenty, making more noise than I'd like to think we should have. The woods felt different now, menacing, hostile. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. The whistling had stopped, thankfully. But the silence was almost worse. It felt heavy, expectant, like something was still out there watching us, waiting. We kept looking back over our shoulders, scanning the trees, half expecting to see those glowing eyes peering out at us from the darkness. Every now and then, one of us would jump at a shadow or a strange shape in the trees, convinced it was back there, chasing us. The hike down seemed to take forever. It was steeper going down than going up, and in the dark, with our fear-addled brains and shaky legs, we kept slipping and stumbling. Every fall, every stumble sent a fresh wave of panic through me. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only an hour or so, we reached the trailhead. The parking lot. The car. Sweet, blessed civilization. The car never looked so good. We piled into Austin's old Jeep, fumbling with seatbelts, practically falling over each other in our rush to get inside and get out of there. Austin fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped them. He finally got the engine started, and we didn't waste any time. He slammed the Jeep into reverse, backed out of the parking spot way too fast, and then peeled out onto the road. Nobody spoke for a long time as we drove, just sat there in stunned silence, breathing heavily, the tension slowly starting to ease as we got further and further away from Black Canyon. Finally, after maybe 15 minutes of driving, Austin spoke, his voice still shaky. Did you really see it, Jerome?" Jerome, who had been staring out the window in a daze, turned slowly and nodded. His face was pale and drawn. "Yeah," he whispered. "I really did. I swear to God, it was like something out of a nightmare." Alex nodded too, his voice barely audible. I believe you. I believe you both. I felt something out there. Something wasn't right. I just didn't want to believe it." I just nodded along with them, still too shaken to really talk. The image of that thing, that face, was still burned into my mind. The fear was still clinging to me, like a cold, clammy hand. We drove the rest of the way home in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, replaying the events of the night, trying to process what we had seen, what we had experienced. We never talked about it much after that. Not really. We'd mention it sometimes in hushed tones amongst ourselves, but never to anyone else. Who would believe us? Yeah, we saw Bigfoot in Black Canyon. They'd laugh us out of the room, so we kept it to ourselves. A shared secret, a shared trauma. Something we'd gone through together, something that changed us all in ways we probably didn't even realize at the time. And to this day, years later, whenever I'm out in the woods, especially in the evening, especially in a place like Black Canyon, I can't shake that feeling of being watched, that feeling that something is out there, lurking just beyond the edge of the firelight, listening to every sound, watching every move. And sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear it, that faint, eerie whistling sound echoing in my memory, and I can still smell it, that musky, unsettling odor hanging in the air. And I know, deep down, that it wasn't just my imagination. It wasn't just a bird. It wasn't just shadows. It was real, and it was out there. And sometimes I wonder if it's still watching, waiting. Story 3. Okay, so this is hard to talk about even now, so many years later. I guess sharing it online with people who might actually understand is better than keeping it bottled up like it always has been. This happened back in '98. I think I was 19, maybe 20. Anyway, me, my brother Jesse, and a couple of his friends, Mark and Kevin, decided to go mudding up Immigration Canyon. We lived near Salt Lake then, and everyone knew about Immigration Canyon, out past the city, heading towards the mountains. It was late, probably close to 10 at night, when we finally got ourselves organized. Typical guy thing, everyone saying they were ready, and then someone needed gas, or forgot their cigarettes, or had to make a last-minute bathroom run. By the time we were actually in Jesse's truck, heading up Canyon Road, it was already pitch black. Canyon Road is paved, at least the beginning part, but once you go deeper, it turns into dirt tracks, proper off-road stuff. That's where we wanted to go. We had Jesse's old beat-up Chevy pickup, the kind that could take a beating and not complain. He'd jacked it up a bit, put on some bigger tires, nothing fancy, but enough to have some fun. We were all hyped, blasting music, laughing, just that typical Friday night kind of energy. I was in the front passenger seat, Jesse was driving, of course, and Mark and Kevin were crammed in the back. It was getting colder as we drove higher up, and the trees were getting thicker on both sides of the road. We were past the houses, past the last little convenience store way back down the canyon, nothing but trees and dark mountain around us. The road was winding and climbing, and the headlights cut through the black, lighting up the trees and rocks on either side. We found this spot where the road widened out a bit, looked like a pull-off maybe people used during the day for hikes or something. Jesse pulled over, killed the engine. Suddenly it was silent, really silent. You know that kind of silence you only get out in the woods, away from everything. No traffic, no people, just quiet. We were getting ready to switch to four-wheel drive, let some air out of the tires, get ready for the mud. Jesse reached for the gear shift, and then just stopped. I was looking at him, asking what was wrong, and that's when I saw it. He wasn't looking at me. His eyes were locked straight ahead, staring out the windshield, and his face, it just drained of color. Like all the blood had rushed out of his face in a split second. His mouth was slightly open, and he was breathing kind of shallow and fast. I followed his gaze. At first, I didn't see anything, just darkness beyond the headlights. The trees right at the edge of the road were thick black shapes against the slightly less black sky. And then my eyes adjusted, or maybe whatever it was moved, I don't know. But suddenly it was there, standing right in front of the truck. Maybe 10 feet away max, just there. It was big, like really impossibly big, taller than any man I've ever seen, taller than a doorway, taller than seemed possible. It was a figure, shaped like a person, kind of, but wrong. All wrong. It was dark. Darker than the trees behind it, a deep, matte black that seemed to absorb the light from our headlights. I couldn't really make out details at first. It was like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Then I started to see more. It was hairy, covered in dark hair all over, long, matted, thick-looking hair. And it was swaying, just slightly, but it was moving, swaying from side to side, like it was unstable. or maybe just restless. The way it moved wasn't natural, wasn't human. And then I saw its face, or where its face should have been. It was shadowed, mostly hidden by that hair, but I could see the shape. Heavy brow, a flat nose, and eyes. Just 2 points of darkness, but I could feel them, staring at us, burning into us. That's the only way I can describe it. Burning. It was just standing there, motionless except for that slow, creepy swaying, staring at us. And we were staring back, all of us frozen, like rabbits caught in headlights. The music had stopped. Nobody was laughing anymore. Nobody was even breathing, I think. The air in the truck felt thick and heavy, like I couldn't get enough air into my lungs. My heart started hammering against my ribs, so hard it hurt. Time seemed to stretch out. Seconds felt like minutes, minutes felt like hours. Just us, in the truck, and that thing standing in front of us, swaying, staring. The silence was deafening. I could hear my own pulse pounding in my ears. I could feel the cold sweat breaking out on my skin, even though it was freezing in the truck. Then the fear hit. It wasn't just being scared. It was pure, primal terror. The kind of fear that goes right down to your bones, that makes you want to scream and run and hide all at the same time. Looking at that thing, it wasn't like looking at something from this world. It was ancient, something that shouldn't be there, something wrong. Jesse finally moved. Not to drive, not to run, just to reach for the horn. He must have thought, I don't know what he thought, maybe he thought he could scare it, like you'd scare a deer or something. Dumb, I know, looking back. But in that moment, in that fear, dumb thoughts are all you got. He slammed his fist on the horn. Blare! The horn echoed through the canyon, shattering the silence. It was loud, jarring, in that still night. We all jumped, even though we knew it was coming. But the thing, it didn't even flinch. Didn't jump, didn't twitch, nothing. It just kept standing there, swaying, staring. It was like the horn didn't even register for it. Like it was deaf, or maybe just indifferent. And then it moved, slowly, deliberately. It took a step towards the truck. Not a run, not a charge, just a step. But that step was the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. Because it showed that it wasn't scared of us. It wasn't going to run away. It was coming closer, to us. That's when Jesse lost it, completely lost it. I saw his eyes go wide, and he started making this sound, this choked, gasping sound. He didn't say anything. He just threw the truck into reverse, slammed his foot down on the gas, and we were thrown back against our seats. The tires screeched on the gravel, spitting rocks and dirt. The truck lurched backwards, bouncing and swaying, flying back down Canyon Road in reverse. We were going way too fast, bouncing over rocks and ruts, the truck bucking like a wild horse. Branches scraped against the sides, the engine was roaring, and all I could hear was the sound of the tires and the wind rushing past, and Jesse's ragged breathing beside me. I was thrown around in my seat, banging my head against the window, holding on for dear life. Mark and Kevin were yelling in the back, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I was just staring out the back window, watching the road fly by, trees blurring into streaks of green and black. And then, for just a second in the rearview mirror, I saw it again. It was standing there at the edge of the road where we had been. But it wasn't just standing there anymore. It was turning towards us, and it started to move, not towards the road, but up. There was a steep slope right there, going up into the woods, and it just went up it, just started climbing, straight up the side of the mountain. And it was fast, unbelievably fast. It moved on 2 legs like a person, but it was covering ground faster than anything I've ever seen. Faster than a deer, faster than a bear, faster than anything human. It was just gone. 1 second it was there, a dark shape against the trees, and the next second it was swallowed up by the woods. Vanished, like it had just dissolved into the darkness. Jesse kept driving. He didn't stop, didn't slow down, didn't say a word. He just drove. backwards all the way down Canyon Road until we were back on the paved part, back past the houses, back towards town. It felt like we drove in reverse for miles and miles. Finally, when we were back on the main road, Jesse pulled over. He put the truck in park, turned off the engine, and just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The silence came back, but this time it was different. Not the quiet of the woods, but the heavy, ringing silence of shock. Nobody said anything for a long time. We were all just sitting there, breathing hard, staring straight ahead. Mark and Kevin were still in the back, white-faced, looking like they'd seen a ghost, which I guess maybe we had. Finally, after what felt like forever, Kevin spoke. His voice was shaky, quiet. What the hell was that? Nobody answered him, because none of us knew, none of us had any idea what we had just seen. Jesse just shook his head slowly. He still didn't look at any of us. He just kept staring straight ahead. After a minute, he said, in a voice that was barely a whisper, I don't know. Then he started the truck again, and we drove home, in silence. The music stayed off. Nobody laughed. Nobody said anything. We were all just processing, or trying to process. The rest of the night was a blur. We got back to Jesse's place and just sat around not talking. Eventually, Mark and Kevin left, saying they needed to get home. Me and Jesse just stayed up, sitting in the living room, watching TV with the sound off. We couldn't talk about it. We just couldn't. It was too big, too unbelievable, too scary. We never went back to Immigration Canyon. Not ever. Not even during the day. Just the thought of that place. It makes my skin crawl. Even now, all these years later, just thinking about it, I get that same cold, sick feeling in my stomach. We never told anyone else what happened. Not really. We'd say something vague, like, we saw something weird up in the canyon, if anyone asked about it, but we never went into detail. People would have thought we were crazy. And maybe we were. Maybe we imagined it. Maybe it was some trick of the light, some weird animal, some hallucination brought on by the dark and the quiet and the adrenaline. But I know what I saw. We all saw it. And I know it wasn't an animal. It wasn't a deer or a bear or a mountain lion. It was something else, something more, something human, but not, something other. And the way it looked at us, that stare, I can still see it in my nightmares. Those dark, empty eyes, they felt like they were looking right through us, seeing something inside us that we didn't even know was there. To this day, I can't explain it. I don't know what it was. I don't know why it was there. I don't know why it just stood there, swaying, staring, and I don't know why it started to come towards us. All I know is that I saw it, and it scared me more than anything else in my entire life. And I'll never, ever forget it. I still get chills thinking about it right now, just writing this down. That night in Immigration Canyon, it changed something in me. It showed me that there are things out there in the world that we don't understand. Things that are beyond our understanding, things that are terrifying, and sometimes late at night when it's really quiet, I still wonder, what if we hadn't driven away? What if we had stayed there? What would have happened then? I don't want to know, and I'm just grateful that we got out of there, even if I still have no idea what it actually was. And sometimes I swear, when the wind blows just right through the trees outside my window at night, I think I can still hear it, that slow, rhythmic swaying, and I swear I can feel those eyes on me again, burning in the dark, and it makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up, even now. Story 4. Okay, so I don't even know where to start with this. I guess I just need to get it out there, you know? It's been eating at me for years, and every now and then it just bubbles up again, and I feel like I'm going crazy all over. For context, I used to work at Livermore Lab, not like a scientist or anything cool, just facilities. Maintenance crew, think mopping floors, changing light bulbs, that kind of thing. Mostly in the administrative buildings, but sometimes they'd send us out to Redwood Point. That's where things got weird. Redwood Point is different. Even back then, before all the fancy upgrades and everything, you could just feel it was different. More secluded, more secure. The energy was heavier there, I guess. Not bad, not exactly, but just thick. Like the air was denser, even though it was the same air we all breathed everywhere else. We all knew the rumors, of course. Everyone who worked at Livermore knew something was up with Redwood Point. Whispers of crazy experiments, secret stuff the government was hiding, alien tech, you name it. It was just part of the folklore, you know, like workplace legends to make the boring bits a little more interesting. Most of us laughed it off, but there was always a little part of you that wondered, what if? One story, though, that used to go around, and it sounds completely nuts now, even saying it out loud, was about Bigfoot. Invisible Bigfoot. Yeah, I know, roll your eyes. But seriously, people talked about it. Older guys, mostly, guys who'd been there for decades. They'd tell these hushed stories late at night in the break room about how back in the 60s and 70s they'd captured something at Redwood Point. Something invisible. Something like Bigfoot, but not. Something more. They said it had abilities, some kind of dimensional thing that made it invisible. Like it wasn't quite in our world all the time or something like that. Sounded like total sci-fi nonsense. And then they'd talk about how they kept it down in the underground labs, studying it. And Stephen Hawking? Apparently, he even came out to look at it at some point, according to the stories. I have no idea if any of that's true. It sounds ridiculous, I know. But stick with me. Anyway, this one day, it was just a normal Tuesday, I think. We got the call early, like 6 a.m. Maintenance crew to Redwood Point Sector 7 priority. Sector 7 was one of the underground levels. We didn't usually go down there. Mostly restricted access, scientists only, that kind of thing. So already my stomach did a little flip. Priority call to Sector 7. Something was definitely up. We got down there in the service elevator, me, Marcos, and young Sarah, who was pretty new to the team. The air was even heavier underground, colder too, even though it was California summer. The hallways in Sector 7 were different, narrower, lower ceilings, bare concrete walls, no paint, just this cold, grey, brutalist vibe. It felt sterile, but in a wrong way, like a hospital morgue, not a clean room. We were supposed to check a busted fluorescent light fixture in Lab 7B, they told us. Sounded simple enough. But the way they'd rushed us down there, the serious tone in the dispatcher's voice, it didn't feel like just a light bulb. We found Lab 7B. Metal door, thick, with a keypad and a little window, like something out of a movie. Marcos had the keycard to open it. He swiped it, the green light flashed, and we stepped inside. The lab was weirdly empty. Just a big room, mostly bare. Stainless steel tables, a couple of chairs, some equipment pushed back against the walls, covered in sheets. But the strangest thing was the light. It was fluorescent, yes, but it was also flickering. Not like a normal bad bulb, but subtly, almost like it was breathing. And it cast these weird, stretched shadows that didn't quite make sense. We found the busted fixture easy enough, just a standard tube, burned out. No big deal. But as Marcos was up on the ladder changing it, Sarah and I were just looking around, trying to figure out why we'd been rushed down to this creepy place for a light bulb. That's when I heard it. A sound. Faint, but distinct. Like heavy breathing. Not like a person breathing heavily after running. More animalistic. Deep, raspy breaths. Coming from somewhere in the room. I froze. Sarah heard it too. I saw her eyes go wide. She looked right at me and mouthed, "Did you hear that?" I nodded slowly. Marcos was still up on the ladder, messing with the wiring. Didn't seem to notice anything. The breathing sound got a little louder. Closer, maybe. It was hard to tell. The room was quiet except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and this breathing. Then something moved, not visibly moved, not at first, but the air shifted. Like when you walk past a hot stove and feel that ripple of heat. It was like that, but cold. A ripple of cold, displaced air, right in front of me, about chest height. My heart started pounding in my chest. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. I took a step back, bumping into one of the stainless steel tables. It rattled, a loud clang in the quiet lab. Marcos finally turned around, looking annoyed. "What was that?" he said from the ladder. "Shh," I hissed, pointing vaguely in front of me. "Did you hear that breathing?" He frowned. "Breathing? What are you talking about? Just change the damn bulb, Carlos." But Sarah had gone completely pale. She was staring at the same spot in the air as me. And then she pointed. Her finger was trembling. "Look," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I followed her finger, and that's when I saw it, or didn't see it. It was like a distortion in the air itself, like heat haze on hot asphalt, but subtler, more shimmery. And it was the shape of something big, something bulky, vaguely humanoid, but indistinct, like looking through warped glass. And it was moving, slowly, drifting across the room, right towards us. Marcos still couldn't see it. He was squinting, looking at Sarah's finger, then at me, completely lost. "I don't see anything. What are you two?" That's when it brushed past him on the ladder. He yelped, not a scream but a sharp, surprised yell. He lost his balance and scrambled to grab onto the ladder rungs, nearly falling off. He was looking around wildly, like something had just poked him. But there was nothing there, just air. "What the hell was that?" he yelled, climbing down the ladder, shaken. "Something just brushed me. Felt like ice." He rubbed his arm, staring at us like we were playing a prank on him. But the look on Sarah's face and mine must have told him something was really wrong. The breathing sound was louder now, closer. The shimmering distortion in the air was more defined. I could almost make out a head shape, broad shoulders, long arms hanging down. It was like a huge invisible figure right there in the room with us. Fear, real bone-chilling fear, slammed into me. My legs felt weak. My throat was dry. I wanted to run, but I was frozen. Sarah was backed up against the wall, eyes wide, practically vibrating with terror. Marcos, even though he still couldn't see it, was starting to get it. He could see our fear, and he felt something. He kept looking around, his face getting paler and paler. He was reaching out, touching the air in front of him, like he was trying to feel for something he couldn't see. And then he touched it. Or it touched him. Hard to say. But he flinched back, like he'd touched a live wire. "God, it's cold, freezing," he stammered, backing away. What the hell is that?" The invisible thing kept moving, drifting closer. It was heading towards the back wall of the lab, where all that covered equipment was. It moved with a slow, deliberate pace, not aggressive, not threatening exactly, but just there. Massive, silent, and invisible, breathing heavily in the same room as us. It reached the wall, and then it walked right through it. Just phased through solid concrete and steel like it wasn't even there. The shimmering distortion rippled for a second, and then it was gone. The breathing stopped. The room went silent again, just the hum of the lights and the pounding of my heart in my ears. We stood there, frozen, for what felt like forever. Marcos was breathing hard, still staring at the wall. Sarah was just staring blankly at the spot where it had been. I felt like I was going to throw up. Finally, Marcos found his voice. It was shaky. Did you see that? Did you see it walk through the wall?" Sarah nodded slowly. Tears were welling up in her eyes. I just nodded too, numb. What? What the hell was that, Carlos? Marcos asked again, his voice cracking. I shook my head. I don't know, but... And then the stories, those crazy stories flashed in my mind. The invisible Bigfoot, the Redwood Point rumors, the whispered legends in the break room. But there's a story, I managed to say, my voice trembling. A story about something like that? Here, invisible. Something. Marcos stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Invisible something. Carlos, what are you? Just then the lights flickered again. This time more violently. The flickering was faster, erratic, like the lights were panicking. And we heard another sound. A faint, clicking sound, coming from somewhere above us, from the ceiling panels. Click, 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 like claws. Light taps, rhythmic, moving across the ceiling panels, above us. We all looked up. Sarah screamed, a short, sharp scream that cut through the silence. She was pointing at the ceiling, and there it was. A new distortion, above us in the ceiling panels, a faint shimmering right there overhead, moving slowly across the panels right above us. The clicking sound was coming from directly above the distortion. It was in the ceiling now, whatever it was. It had gone through the wall, and now it was in the ceiling. Marcos grabbed my arm. "We gotta get out of here," he whispered, his eyes wide with pure terror. "Now, let's go. Forget the light, forget everything. We gotta get out." He didn't have to tell me twice. I grabbed Sarah's hand, and we ran. We bolted for the door, fumbling with the keycard, desperate to get out of that lab. We got the door open and scrambled back into the hallway, running as fast as we could towards the elevator. We didn't stop running until we were back in the service elevator, doors closed, going up away from Sector 7. We were all breathing hard, sweating, shaking. Sarah was still crying silently, tears streaming down her face. Marcos was just staring straight ahead, white as a ghost. I could still feel the cold, that chilling ripple in the air in my mind, even as the elevator went up, away from that place. We never talked about it, not to each other, not to anyone else at work. It was like a silent pact. We just pretended it never happened, went back to our normal routines, back to mopping floors and changing light bulbs. We avoided Redwood Point after that, if we could. And we definitely never went back to Sector 7. But I never forgot it. The cold air, the shimmering distortion, the heavy breathing, the feeling of presence. Something massive, invisible, and utterly wrong. And sometimes late at night, when everything's quiet, I still hear it, just in my head. That faint, raspy breathing, and I wonder, what was it? What did we see? Or not see? And is it still there? Down in Redwood Point, hidden in the shadows, invisible to the world? I don't know, and I don't think I ever will. But I know what I experienced that day, and it wasn't just a bad light bulb. It was something else, something terrifying and real, too real. Story 5. I left her place later than I intended, maybe around 10:30. Huntley Road, the one that takes you out of Willow Creek and connects to the bigger roads. It's a quiet one, especially at night. Trees hanging over the road, not much street lighting past the main part of town. Normally I like it, kind of peaceful driving in the dark like that. I had the radio on low, just some soft music to keep me company, nothing loud, just background. And then I saw it. Honestly, at first, I thought it was a deer. Or maybe a dog, a really big one. Something dark moved out of the trees on the side of the road, kind of lumbered into the beam of my headlights. I instinctively lifted my foot off the gas, started to slow down. It was big, bulky, that dark shadow against the dark road, hard to make out details right away. My brain was still catching up, figuring out what it was. Then it stepped fully into the road. And it wasn't a deer. It wasn't a dog. It was... I don't even know how to properly describe it even now, months later. It was tall, taller than I thought at first. When it stepped into the road, it was on all fours, kind of hunched over, but then it stopped moving right in the middle of my lane, and it started to rise up, slowly. It was dark, completely dark fur, or hair, or whatever you want to call it, thick, matted looking in the dim light from my headlights. As it stood up, it got bigger, way bigger than any dog or deer. I'm not exaggerating. This thing must have been close to 7 feet tall when it was fully upright. 7 feet. I'm 5'4". You can imagine how small I felt suddenly sitting in my car looking at this thing. It was broad too, really thick-set, muscled looking, and its arms, they weren't like a bear's arms or a dog's legs. They were long, way too long for a bear standing up. They hung down almost to its knees, and the hands, or paws, whatever they were, they looked big, thick, with what looked like claws. I could see the outline even in the dark, catching the light from my car. Its head, that's the part that freaks me out the most when I try to remember it clearly. It wasn't dog-like or bear-like. It was flatter, almost like a primate, but elongated, stretched out. And the eyes, I couldn't see the eyes properly, not really, but I could see the reflection in the headlights, and they were red. Not like shining red, more like a dull, deep red glow, like embers. It just stood there, completely still, staring in my direction. I know it was staring at me, even though I couldn't make out proper features in that dark fur. But I could feel it looking at me, just standing in the middle of the road, blocking my way, this massive, dark creature. My heart went ballistic. Seriously, I could feel it hammering against my ribs. My hands went cold, clammy on the steering wheel. My foot was frozen on the brake pedal. I just stared at it, my mind completely blank. Everything I thought I knew about the world, about animals, about what was real and what wasn't, it just dissolved. This thing in front of me, it shouldn't exist. It couldn't exist. But it was there, solid, real, blocking my road home. Time slowed down. I know it sounds cliché, but it did. Each second felt stretched out, heavy. The silence was thick, except for the low hum of my car engine, which suddenly seemed ridiculously loud and out of place. The music on the radio was still playing softly, some woman singing about love or something, and it sounded completely insane against what was happening right in front of me. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it moved, but not towards me. Thank God, not towards me. It moved fast, much faster than something that big should be able to move. It dropped back down onto all fours, and it was agile, incredibly agile. It didn't just run, it seemed to flow. It leaped across the road, leaped like a cat, but a gigantic, monstrous cat, and it went straight into my neighbor's yard on the other side of the road. My neighbor, Mr. Henderson, lives in that big old house with the huge yard and the even bigger trees that surround it. You can barely see his house from the road in the daytime, let alone at night. This thing, this creature just vanished into those trees. 1 second it was there in my headlights, looming over my car, and the next it was gone, swallowed up by the dark shadows under Mr. Henderson's trees. I sat there for what felt like ages, just frozen. My car was still running, headlights shining into the empty road where it had been standing. My body was shaking. I could feel it, a full body tremble, from my teeth chattering to my knees knocking. I think I even forgot to breathe for a while. Slowly, like moving through treacle, I put the car in drive. My hands were shaking so much I could barely feel the gear shift. I crept forward, inch by inch, looking at the place where it had disappeared, expecting it to jump out any second, come crashing through the bushes, come after me. Nothing. Just darkness and the rustling of leaves in the slight breeze. I kept driving, very slowly, all the way past Mr. Henderson's house. My eyes were fixed on the trees lining his property, scanning the shadows, waiting for something, anything, to move. But there was nothing, Just trees and shadows. Normal trees, normal shadows. Except I knew they weren't normal anymore. Not for me. I didn't speed up until I was way past his house, way down the road, practically back to the main highway. Then I put my foot down and just drove. Drove like hell. Didn't stop until I was back in my own driveway, lights off, engine off, just sitting there in the dark, in my car, still shaking. It took me a good 10 minutes before I could even unlock the car door and get out. My legs felt like jelly when I finally stood up. Everything felt unreal, like I'd dreamt it or imagined it. But my heart was still pounding, my hands were still shaking, and this cold dread was sitting like a stone in my stomach. That wasn't a dream. That was real. I saw it. I stumbled inside, locked the door behind me, bolted it. Went through the house, locking every window, checking every door, like some kind of crazy person. Even though logically I knew, whatever that thing was, it wasn't going to come chasing me to my house. But logic didn't matter anymore. Logic had gone out the window the second I saw it standing in the road. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't sleep. I sat up in bed, lights on, just staring at the ceiling, replaying the whole thing in my head over and over again. Trying to make sense of it, trying to convince myself it was something else, something normal, something I'd misidentified in the dark, in the shock. But I knew deep down, in that cold, terrified part of my mind, that I hadn't. I had seen something else. The next day I was a wreck. Went to work, went through the motions, teaching my classes, smiling at the kids, pretending everything was fine. But inside I was churning. Every little noise made me jump. Every shadow made me flinch. I kept looking out the window, expecting to see, I don't even know what. Footprints the size of dinner plates in the schoolyard, a flash of dark fur in the trees around the playground. It was ridiculous, I know, but the fear was still there, raw and real. Later that week, a couple of days later actually, I went to the local store to get some groceries. You know, the kind of general store that everyone in Willow Creek and the surrounding areas uses. And I overheard a couple of people talking, muttering more like, old Mr. Abernathy, the Amish farmer, was in there, showing something to the store owner, Mrs. Peterson. And old Mr. Henderson, my Mr. Henderson, he was there too, looking all flustered. I tried not to eavesdrop, but it's a small store, and their voices carried. I heard bits and pieces. Fence. Found it caught on the fence. Don't know what animal. Never seen hair like it. Then I heard Mrs. Peterson say, quite loudly actually, sounds like that thing people have been talking about again. What thing? I asked before I could stop myself. I know, bad form to interrupt, but I had to know. My voice came out louder than I intended, a bit shaky. Everyone turned and looked at me. Mr. Henderson looked particularly embarrassed. Mr. Abernathy just kind of nodded in my direction, and Mrs. Peterson, well, she's never been shy. Ilara, dear, you startled me, she said. Oh, they're just talking about some strange animal hair Mr. Abernathy found on his fence line. Says he can't figure out what it's from. Says it's unusual. She gave me a look, a kind of knowing look. I couldn't quite read it. Mr. Abernathy held up a plastic bag. Inside, I could see a clump of something dark. Dark, thick, matted-looking hair. It looked familiar. Horribly familiar. Show her, Abe, Mrs. Peterson said to the farmer. He hesitated for a second, then carefully opened the bag and held it out a bit closer to me. I took a step closer, peered into the bag. It was hair, yeah, animal hair. But not like any animal hair I'd ever seen close up. It was coarse, thick, almost wiry, and jet black. And it was oily looking, greasy almost, even though it was dry. And there was a smell, faint, but there, a musky, wild, almost unpleasant smell, like something feral. My stomach flipped, my breath caught in my throat. This hair, this was the color of the fur I'd seen on the road. The texture, the thickness, it was exactly how I remembered it. Where did you find this? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mr. Abernathy pointed vaguely towards the back of the store, in the general direction of Huntley Road. Back fields, he said in his quiet Amish accent. Fence line by the woods. Something big. Got caught there. Tore a piece off, looks like. Mr. Henderson coughed, shuffled his feet. He looked really uncomfortable. Abe showed it to me, Alara, he said finally. Fence lines near my property. He found it not far from my backwoods. My blood ran cold. Mr. Henderson's backwoods, the woods that surrounded his yard, the woods where that thing disappeared. People been talking, Mrs. Peterson chimed in again, her eyes narrowed, looking right at me. Especially lately. Whispers going around, about things in the woods, things people see at night. She paused, letting that hang in the air. Then she looked directly at me, and she said, very deliberately, You haven't seen anything strange lately on Huntley Road, have you, Ilara? Everyone was looking at me. Mr. Abernathy, Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Peterson, even a couple of other customers who had stopped browsing to listen in, waiting for my answer. I swallowed. My mouth was dry. I could feel my pulse thumping in my ears. Should I say something? Should I tell them what I saw? Tell them about the creature, the size of a bear, standing up like a man, with red eyes and long arms and black fur, disappearing into Mr. Henderson's trees? Would they believe me, or would they think I was crazy, like I'd imagined it, stressed out from work, seeing things in the dark? But then I looked at the hair in the plastic bag again, that dark, coarse, unsettling hair, and I remembered the red eyes in the headlights, the sheer size of it, the terror I felt, and I just couldn't bring myself to say it, to put it into words out loud in front of these people. It felt too unreal, even to me, like if I said it out loud, it would somehow become even more unbelievable. So I just shook my head, slowly. No, I said, my voice still quiet, still shaky. No, Mrs. Peterson. Nothing strange. Just deer, maybe. Lots of deer around here. I forced a weak smile. Probably just a deer. They looked at me for another few seconds, Mrs. Peterson's eyes still sharp, still knowing. But then, slowly, they started to turn away. The conversation shifted, moved on to other things. The weather, local gossip, the price of gas, normal things, everyday things. I bought my groceries, paid for them, and left the store as quickly as I could. Got back in my car, drove home, and I locked the doors again, bolted them again, checked the windows again, and I'm still checking them now. Every night, every shadow in the yard, every rustle in the trees, every time I drive down Huntley Road, especially at night, I'm looking, watching, waiting. Because I know what I saw. I know it wasn't a deer, and I know that hair in that plastic bag, that strange, dark, unsettling hair. It's proof. Proof that I'm not crazy. Proof that something is out there, in the woods, still in the woods maybe, watching me, waiting, and I have no idea what it is, no idea what it wants, no idea if it will ever come out of the woods again. But I'll never forget those red eyes in the dark, never forget the size of it, the fear I felt, never forget standing there, frozen, watching it disappear into my neighbor's yard. And sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and the wind is blowing through the trees outside my window, I swear I can hear something moving in the dark, something heavy, something breathing, just on the edge of hearing, and I wonder if it's still there, out there, watching. Story 6. Okay, so Thanksgiving. Yeah, just finished it like hours ago. Feels like a lifetime, though. I'm still wired, I guess is the word. I don't even know where to start with this, but I gotta tell someone, anyone. It's eating me up. So, dinner at my sister's, Meadowsville. Nice enough, you know, the usual family chaos, way too much food, everyone pretending to get along for a few hours. Left around 10, maybe 10:30. It was properly dark already, and cold like bite-you-to-the-bone cold. December in Meadowsville cold. You get it. I live a bit outside town, have to take 534 to get back, that winding state highway. Anyone who's driven it at night knows it's pitch black, trees crammed in right up to the edge of the road, no streetlights, nothing. Just your headlights and whatever critters decide to dart across in front of you. Usually deer, sometimes raccoons. Never this. I was on autopilot, you know, just cruising, still a little stuffed from turkey and pumpkin pie, listening to some podcast, not really paying too much attention to anything. Traffic was light. Everyone was home, probably in food comas themselves. The road was dry, thank God. Sometimes it gets icy up there this time of year, and that road becomes a death trap. But tonight, it was clear. Just dark. Unbelievably dark. Then I saw it. Or first, I thought I saw something. Just a dark shape on the side of the road up ahead, maybe near the Maple Road intersection. I automatically slowed down a bit, thinking it was maybe someone broken down, or, honestly, my first thought was just deer again, standing at the edge of the woods like they do, waiting to make a run for it across the road. But as I got closer, it wasn't right. Too upright for a deer, and too big. My headlights were hitting it now, kind of at an angle, and I could make out a figure. I genuinely thought at first it was a person. A big person, like linebacker-sized, just standing there at the edge of the woods. Wearing a hoodie, maybe, because the top part of it looked dark and shadowed. It was right at the tree line, where the woods really starts getting dense. There was a car ahead of me, maybe a few car lengths, and they just went straight past, didn't even slow down. I remember thinking, did they see that? Because it was right there. Then, that figure, it started to move. And it wasn't just moving, it was unfolding. It took like 3, maybe 4 steps, long strides, and it was suddenly in the road, completely in the lane. I had to brake, not hard, but enough to drop my speed way down. My heart started to thump. Now it was in my headlights, full on. This wasn't a person, I swear, this was not human. It was tall, massive, covered in hair, dark hair, thick and matted looking, and its head, that's what I can't get out of my head. The way the hair was, like a mullet. I know it sounds insane even saying it, but that's what it looked like. Thick hair on the back of its head, kind of longer and shorter on the sides and top, but not styled, not like a human mullet. Just like its hair grew that way, dark, shaggy hair all over its body, but then this longer, almost styled-looking part on the back of its head. I blinked, hard, thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Thanksgiving dinner, maybe too much wine with dinner, tired from the day, hallucination, but it was there, solid, real, moving. It just kept walking, across the road, from one side to the other, deliberate, like it owned the place. No hurry, no stumbling, just purpose. It passed right by the Maple Road sign. You know that sign? Those state road signs are big. I think they're like 8 feet tall, maybe more, including the pole. This thing's head, the top of its head with that weird hair, was almost as high as the top of that sign. Seriously, it was colossal. And it moved so smoothly. Not like lumbering or clumsy because of its size. Graceful, almost. It got to the other side of the road, and there's that little embankment there down to Cowell Creek, just slid down it. Like water, vanished into the darkness on the other side. 1 second it was there, illuminated in my headlights. This thing. The next second, gone. Just swallowed by the woods and the dark. I sat there for a minute, maybe longer, car still in drive, foot on the brake, staring at the spot where it had been. Just blackness, trees, silence. Except for the podcast still babbling away on my car speakers, completely oblivious to what I'd just seen. It felt surreal, like I'd imagined the whole thing. But I knew I hadn't. I knew what I saw. Finally, I put the car back in gear and drove on. Slowly. My hands were shaking a little, gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. I kept checking my rearview mirror, even though I knew, logically, there was nothing there. Just the empty road behind me. I didn't even really think straight the rest of the drive home. Just kept replaying what I saw in my head. That size, that hair, the way it moved. It wasn't an animal, and it sure as hell wasn't human. What the hell was it? Got home, parked the car in the garage, went inside. The house was quiet. My wife and kids were already asleep. Went into the kitchen, poured myself a stiff drink. Whiskey, neat. Took a long pull. Didn't help much. Just warmed me a little, physically anyway. The cold from seeing that thing that was still inside me. Couldn't sleep. Tossed and turned, images flashing in my head. That creature's eyes. I didn't even see its eyes clearly, just dark shadows where eyes should be under that brow ridge. But I felt like it saw me. Felt like it looked right through me even in those few seconds. And that hair, that goddamn mullet. Why a mullet? It makes it sound ridiculous, I know, but it was there, distinct, unmistakable, and utterly bizarre. By morning I was wrecked, tired, on edge. But the thing I saw, it wasn't going away. It felt realer somehow in the daylight, not less. Like the night's darkness hadn't been some kind of trick. It had just been the backdrop for something genuinely unbelievable to step out of. I knew I had to go back. Stupid maybe, but I had to. I had to see if there was anything that proved I wasn't losing my mind. After breakfast, I told my wife I had to go out for a bit, said something about needing to pick up something for work, didn't elaborate, didn't want to try and explain. She'd think I was crazy. Hell, I was starting to think I was crazy. Drove back out to Meadowsville, to that stretch of 534. It was still cold, but sunny, bright winter day. Everything looked normal, deceptively normal. Drove slowly, looking for Maple Road. Found the intersection, pulled over to the side of the road, just past the Maple Road sign, on the side where it had disappeared. Got out of the car. Felt weirdly exposed in the daylight. Daylight should make things less scary, right? But here it felt wrong. Like the sun wasn't supposed to be shining on this place. Looked around. Woods on both sides of the road, thick with trees, undergrowth. Cowell Creek was down the embankment on the side where I'd seen it go. There's that abandoned trailer park just beyond the woods on that side. I know that area. Always creeped me out, even driving past it during the day. Took a deep breath and walked over to the embankment. It wasn't too steep, but definitely a drop. Went down carefully. The ground was damp and muddy in places. Smelled like damp earth and something else. I couldn't quite place it. Something musky. A little feral. Maybe I was just imagining things again. Got to the bottom, to the edge of the creek. Cowell Creek is small, mostly rocks and shallow water. Could probably wade across it easily in summer. But now it was cold and fast-flowing, winter runoff. The banks were muddy, soft. I started looking for footprints. Any sign of something big having been here. Anything that would prove to myself I wasn't hallucinating. Walked along the creek bank, back and forth, scanning the mud. Nothing, no footprints, not a single clear footprint in the mud. Just regular animal tracks. Deer prints, squirrel prints, maybe raccoon. Nothing big, nothing heavy. My heart sank a little. Was I crazy? Had I made it all up? Was it just some weird trick of the light, tiredness, too much food, too much booze? But I knew what I saw. I saw it. Then I saw something else, further down the creek bank, where the mud was thicker, closer to the water's edge. Marks in the mud, not footprints, but gouges, deep scrapes, like something heavy had dragged itself across the mud. Long, uneven lines, going from the bank down into the creek itself, and some smaller ones going up the other bank into the woods on the far side. They weren't footprints, but they were something. Something heavy. Something that had clearly crossed the creek here. Whatever it was, it had left its mark on the mud, literally scratched into the earth. And they weren't just shallow scratches. These were deep, like they'd been made by claws or something sharp and strong, dragging through the mud and scraping against the rocks underneath. I followed the marks down to the creek edge, could see where they entered the water, then re-emerged on the other side, leading up into the trees. Couldn't follow them for long on the other side. The ground was too covered in leaves and pine needles. But they were there, going into the woods, towards the abandoned trailer park. No footprints, just these scratches, like something didn't walk but slid or dragged itself. But it moved upright. I saw it move upright on the road. Why would it drag itself through the creek? I walked back up to the road, climbed back up the embankment, stood there looking back at the woods, at the spot where I'd seen it vanish. The sun was a little higher now. The woods looked less menacing, more ordinary. But I knew they weren't. Not anymore. Not after what I saw, not after finding those marks in the mud. Drove home feeling, I don't know, less crazy maybe, knowing I hadn't completely imagined it, but more disturbed. Because what was it? And what left those marks? And why no footprints? I haven't told anyone about this, not really. Just brushed it off as seeing things when I was tired if anyone asked why I was so quiet after Thanksgiving. My wife noticed I was off, but just figured I was stressed about work, which honestly is easier than trying to explain any of this. But I can't shake it. It's like a splinter under my skin. It's there, constantly nagging, reminding me of what I saw and what I don't understand. Sometimes late at night, when it's really dark and quiet, I think about those woods and that trailer park and that thing, whatever it was, out there in the dark. And I wonder if it's still there, if it watches the road at night, if anyone else has seen it, if it'll ever cross the road again. And sometimes, when I drive home late, especially on 534, even now, weeks later, I can't help but slow down a little when I get to Maple Road, just to look, to see if anything's there. Standing at the edge of the woods, waiting. So far nothing, just the dark trees, the empty road. But I know what I saw, and I know it was real, and I know I'll never forget it. Never. Story 7. It was the summer I turned 10, and my cousin Clara, who was just a year older, was staying with us for a few weeks in Pinewood, Ohio. My grandparents had this huge property out in the country, mostly fields and woods around this creek called Rock Creek. Summers there were the best, just pure freedom. We'd be outside from sunup to sundown, exploring, getting into minor trouble, you know, kid stuff. This particular day, it had to have been late July, because it was ridiculously hot. That sticky, heavy heat that makes the air feel thick. We were barefoot, of course, because shoes were basically optional in the summer at Grandma's. We were running through this field that sloped down towards a really dense patch of woods. I remember the sun just baking down on our skin, and the grass was dry and scratchy between our toes. We were playing some game I don't even remember now, tag probably, or maybe pretending we were explorers in the jungle or something. We were just kids, full of energy and making a lot of noise, laughing and yelling. Then just like that, we both went silent. It wasn't like something specific happened at first. It was more of a shift. The birds that had been chirping, they seemed to quiet down. Even the cicadas, which usually were deafening in the summer heat, seemed to dial it back a notch. It got heavy, like a weight dropped on the air, and we both just stopped running, standing there in the middle of the field, looking at each other. We could feel it, this sudden change, even before we saw anything. I don't know how long we stood there frozen, maybe just a few seconds, but it felt much longer. And then I saw it. Or rather, we saw it, because Clara gasped at the same moment I did. It was at the edge of the woods, maybe 100 yards away, across the open field, right where the field met the trees. Something was moving there. At first, it was just a dark shape in the shadows of the woods, but then it stepped out into the sunlight, and we both just stopped breathing. It was huge, just massive and dark, like the blackest black you can imagine, like a shadow that had somehow become solid. My first thought, and I know Clara said she thought the same thing later, was gorilla. I know it sounds ridiculous, a gorilla in Ohio, but that's what it looked like, at least at first glance, this huge, hulking, dark shape. It wasn't walking normally like a person would. It was heavier, a lumbering kind of walk, but deliberate, like it knew exactly where it was going. It was coming out of the woods and into the open field. It was moving slowly but with purpose, and it was big. Bigger than anything I'd ever seen outside of a zoo, and even then, this felt different. This felt wrong. It moved out further from the tree line, and the sunlight hit it full on. That's when we saw it clearer. It was covered in dark, matted fur. It wasn't just black, it was deep black, like it absorbed all the light, and it was thick, really thick. It looked strong. The way it moved, it was mostly on two legs, but sometimes it would kind of drop its shoulders forward, like it was going to go onto all fours, but then it would straighten up again. Its arms were long, incredibly long, swinging way out to the sides as it walked. They almost touched the ground when it walked upright, and when it leaned forward a bit, they definitely would have. It was just massive, taller than a person, way taller, and thicker, just built like nothing I'd ever imagined. It didn't look like an animal from TV or a book. It looked real, but impossibly real. And the silence, that's what I remember most, besides the size of it. It wasn't just quiet, it was dead quiet. Like everything around us had stopped, just holding its breath. Even the wind seemed to stop. There was no rustling of leaves, no insect sounds, nothing. Just us and that thing moving across the field. Terror, pure, cold terror. It just washed over us. It wasn't like being scared of the dark or scared of a thunderstorm. This was something else. This was primal, like my body knew instantly that we were in danger. Real danger. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My breath hitched in my chest, and I couldn't seem to get enough air. Clara grabbed my hand, squeezing it so tight it hurt, and I squeezed back just as hard. We were both frozen, locked in place, just staring. I don't know how long we stood there, paralyzed. It felt like forever, like we were trapped in a nightmare. Finally, I think it was Clara who moved first, or maybe we moved at the same time. I don't even remember. But suddenly we were screaming, loud, high-pitched screams that ripped through the stillness. And we started running as fast as our legs could carry us back towards the house, which felt miles away at that moment, even though it wasn't really that far. But when you're terrified, everything seems farther and scarier and more impossible. We were screaming and crying and stumbling, tripping over the uneven ground, but we didn't stop. We just kept running, our bare feet pounding on the dry dirt, gravel and grass, each breath burning in our chests. I don't think we looked back, not even once. We just ran, fueled by pure, unadulterated panic. I remember the sting of tears in my eyes, the taste of panic in my mouth, the feeling of my lungs screaming for air. All I could think about was getting back to the house, to my mom, to safety. We burst through the back screen door, slamming it open so hard it banged against the frame. My mom was in the kitchen, at the counter, probably making sandwiches or something. I can't even picture it clearly now, but I remember her turning around, looking at us, and her face just went white. We were a mess. Red-faced, sweaty, dirt-streaked, panting, tears streaming down our faces. We were babbling, both of us at once, trying to get the words out. Gorilla! Field! Big! Scary! My mom knelt down, grabbing us both by the shoulders. Whoa, whoa, slow down! What's wrong? What happened? We were still gasping for breath, trying to make sense. In the field, by the woods, a gorilla, a huge gorilla. My mom's eyebrows furrowed. A gorilla? What are you talking about? There are no gorillas in Ohio. She sounded confused, but also like she already didn't believe us. Yes, there was. We saw it. It was huge and black, and it walked like a gorilla, Clara insisted, still shaking. I nodded, backing her up. It was really big and scary. My mom sighed, that kind of sigh that parents do when they think you're being dramatic. Girls, there are no gorillas around here. You probably saw a big dog, maybe. Or, I don't know, a bear. No, it wasn't a bear. We know what a bear looks like. We saw bears at the zoo, I argued, getting frustrated that she wasn't understanding. It was black and hairy and walked on two legs sometimes, but then it would lean forward, Clara added, trying to explain. Honey, maybe you saw a black bear, my mom said again, still trying to be reasonable. They have them in Ohio. Sometimes they wander out of the woods. But it walked on two legs, I repeated, feeling like we weren't getting through to her at all. For a little bit anyway, and it was huge, bigger than a bear, way bigger. It was like a monster, Clara whispered, her voice still shaky. My mom hugged us both tightly. Okay, you guys got scared, I get it, but it was probably just a bear, a big black bear. They can look scary. She was trying to reassure us, but it didn't work. We knew what we saw. She told us we weren't allowed to go back out near the woods anymore that day. You can play inside now. It's too hot out anyway, she said, trying to sound cheerful. But we were still too shaken up to even think about playing. We just sat on the living room floor, still trembling, replaying what we'd seen in our heads. For weeks after that, I couldn't shake the feeling. I wouldn't go anywhere near that field again. Even looking out the windows towards the woods gave me the creeps. I kept thinking about that thing, that massive dark shape moving across the field. My mom never really believed us. She kept saying it was just our imaginations, or a bear, or we'd gotten scared by shadows. Adults always have a way of explaining things away, making them seem smaller and less real. But I knew what I saw. And Clara knew too. We talked about it a lot that summer, whispering about it in bed at night, trying to make sense of it. We drew pictures of it, trying to capture the size and the shape, the way it moved. But words and drawings never seemed to be enough to describe what we had witnessed. Years went by. We grew up, moved on. We still talked about it sometimes when we were together, a kind of shared, strange memory. It became a sort of family story. The time the girls saw the gorilla. It almost became funny in a way. A silly childhood memory, easily dismissed as kids' imaginations running wild in the summer heat. Then I was in college, years later. I was home for Thanksgiving, and we were all in the living room after dinner, channel surfing on TV. And I stopped, suddenly, completely frozen. There was this old, grainy, black and white film on the screen. Just a few seconds of shaky footage of some creature walking through the woods. It was the Patterson-Gimlin film. I had never seen it before, never even heard of it probably. But as soon as I saw it, a jolt went through me. It was like a lightning strike of recognition, mixed with a bone-deep chill. The way that creature in the film walked, the way its arms swung, the sheer size and bulk of it. It was exactly what we had seen that day in the field in Pinewood. Exactly. There was no mistaking it. I felt the blood drain from my face. I think I actually gasped out loud. Everyone in the room looked at me. "Sophia, you okay?" my mom asked. I couldn't speak for a second. I just pointed at the TV. That's it. That's what we saw, that day, in the field. My mom looked at the screen, then back at me, a confused look on her face. "Honey, that's just some old movie. What are you talking about?" "No, Mom. That walk, the way it moves, that's exactly how it moved. The arms, the way it kind of leaned forward, it's exactly the same." My voice was shaking. I tried to explain, to describe what we had seen, how it had felt, but it was like trying to explain a dream. Words just didn't capture it. The grainy film kept playing on the screen, that figure striding through the trees, and my heart was pounding all over again, just like it had that day. Nobody else really got it. They just saw an old film, probably thought it was some kind of hoax or a guy in a suit. They dismissed it, just like they had dismissed us all those years ago. But for me, it was like Everything clicked into place. That childhood fear, that lingering unease, that feeling that we had seen something impossible, something real, but inexplicable. It all suddenly made sense, in a terrifying, unsettling way. I don't know what we saw that day. I don't know what that creature in the Patterson-Gimlin film is supposed to be. Bigfoot, Sasquatch. I don't really care about labels. All I know is we saw something. Something real. Something that changed how I look at the world. And to this day, whenever I think back to that hot summer day in Pinewood, the silence in the field, the lumbering, dark figure emerging from the woods, I still get that same cold chill running down my spine. It's like a reminder, a constant, unsettling reminder that there are things out there that we don't understand. Things that exist just beyond the edges of what we think is possible. Things that can step out of the shadows and into the sunlight and leave you frozen in terror, forever changed. And sometimes, I swear, when the wind is just right and the woods are quiet, I can still almost feel that heavy silence hanging in the air, and I can almost see that dark shape moving at the edge of the trees. And I remember the fear, the absolute gut-wrenching fear, and I know, deep down, that whatever it was, whatever we saw, it was real, and it was out there. Story 8. It's still messed up even now, years later. You try to explain it to someone, and you just sound crazy, like you watch too many of those monster movies. But I swear on everything, this happened. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was real. Too real. We were coming back from Florida. My daughter Sarah, she finally graduated college. Big deal for us, first one in the family and all that. The graduation was down in Gainesville, and we decided to drive because we wanted to make a little trip out of it. See some sights, which we did. It was nice, but by the time we were heading back home to Ohio, we were just done. Completely beat. Marcos, my husband, he did most of the driving down, but I took over for the way back. He gets tired quicker than me on long hauls. Anyway, we left Gainesville early, thinking we'd make good time. Florida is huge, man. Just goes on forever. And then Georgia and the Carolinas, all of it just blurring by. We were on I-70 finally, thank God, which meant we were getting close. Ohio territory. Familiar roads, even in the dark. We were probably, I don't know, maybe an hour or so from home, near Ponte Alta, Ohio. It had to be after 3 a.m., that dead of night time when everything feels different, you know, like the world's holding its breath. It was pitch black out. No moon, and the sky was totally overcast. And it was raining, not like a downpour, but that steady, soaking kind of rain that makes everything slick and shiny. The kind that makes you just want to be inside, under a blanket with a hot cup of coffee. We were pushing through it, though, just wanting to get home, get into our own beds. We were both exhausted, but in that good kind of tired, you know, like after you've done something really important, something good. Sarah's graduation, it was a big deal. I remember checking the mile markers. We'd just passed 159, heading west, and the road was empty, completely empty. Not another car in sight, which is normal for that time of morning, especially out there in the sticks. Just us, the rain and the highway stretching out in front of us like a black ribbon. Marcos was dozing in the passenger seat. I could hear him snoring softly every now and then. I had the radio off, just concentrating on driving, trying to stay alert. And then, that's when I saw it. It was on the side of the road, just past the guardrail. It was dark. Really dark, but I still saw it. A shape. Tall. Really tall. Like way taller than a person. It was standing there, just standing, motionless. I only caught it in the headlights for a split second, maybe two, but it was enough. My heart jumped, like a jolt of electricity. I didn't say anything at first. I mean, Marcos, he's a good guy, but he's practical, skeptical about anything weird. He's a show-me-the-proof type of person. And if I started going on about some weird shape I saw in the dark, he'd just brush it off, say I was tired, imagining things. And honestly, maybe I was. Maybe it was just a shadow, or a weirdly shaped tree or something. My mind was trying to find a normal explanation, trying to rationalize it away, but the image just stuck there in my head, that tall, dark shape. Standing there so still, right by the side of the road. It looked furry, like it was covered in hair or something. I didn't get a good look at the details. It was too dark, and we were moving too fast. But that general impression, it was clear. Tall, dark, furry, and just there. I kept driving, my hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. My eyes kept flicking back to the rearview mirror, but there was nothing there. Just the rain, the empty highway behind us, and the darkness. I slowed down a little bit, without really realizing it. My foot just eased off the gas pedal. My mind was racing. What was that thing? What did I just see? We drove for maybe another mile, 2 miles in silence. Marcos was still asleep, or pretending to be maybe. Sometimes he does that when he's too tired to talk. But the silence in the car felt heavy now. Different. It wasn't just the quiet of the late night anymore. It was something else, a feeling, a wrongness, like the air itself was thick with something I couldn't quite put my finger on. And then, Marcos, he spoke. His voice was groggy, like he'd just woken up, but it had this hesitant edge to it, like he was unsure of what he was going to say. He cleared his throat and said, "Rita? Hey, Rita?" "Yeah, honey," I said, trying to sound normal, like nothing was wrong. But my voice probably sounded tight. I could feel my heart still pounding a little faster than usual. He paused for a second, and then he asked, "Rita, did you see something back there, a little ways back, on the side of the road?" My breath caught in my throat. He saw it too. He saw it. Relief flooded through me, mixed with this creeping dread. Relief because I wasn't crazy. Dread because, what the hell did we both just see? "You saw it too?" I asked, my voice a little shaky now. "You really saw it?" "Yeah," he said, still sounding hesitant. "Yeah, I think so. I woke up for a second. I don't know why, just woke up. And I caught something in the headlights. Over by the guardrail. Big, dark, standing there." He trailed off and then asked in this almost whisper, What was that, Rita?" That's when I said it. The words just came out of my mouth before I could even think about them. It looked like one of those Bigfoot things. Silence. A long, heavy silence filled the car. Just the sound of the rain on the windshield and the hum of the tires on the wet asphalt. Marcos didn't say anything for what felt like a really long time. I glanced over at him. He was staring straight ahead, his face pale in the dim light of the dashboard. His mouth was slightly open, like he was about to say something but couldn't find the words. Marcos, the biggest skeptic I know. The guy who laughs at those monster shows on TV. Marcos, who always has a logical explanation for everything. Marcos, who'd probably scoff if you told him the sky was blue without scientific proof. That Marcos. He was silent. Finally, he spoke again, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I think it did. It looked like that. Just like that. No arguments, no skepticism, no trying to explain it away. He just agreed. And that was more terrifying than anything else, because if Marcos was saying he saw it and he thought it was that, then it had to be real. It just had to be. Because Marcos doesn't just believe things. He needs to see it, touch it, analyze it, before he even considers it possible. We drove a little further in silence, both of us just processing, trying to make sense of what we'd just seen or thought we'd seen. And then I asked him, "How big do you think it was?" He thought for a second. "Tall," he said, "really tall. 8 feet maybe? More? 8 feet. That's taller than any man I've ever seen. taller than any animal I've ever seen in real life, except maybe an elephant at the zoo. And this thing wasn't an elephant, it was humanoid, standing upright like a person, but huge. And dark, I added. It was really dark, like dark brown or black fur, maybe? It was hard to tell in the dark. Yeah, dark, he agreed. And bulky. Big shoulders, thick chest. Not skinny. Muscular, maybe. Hard to say for sure. But big. Solid. We kept talking about it, in these hushed tones, like we were afraid someone might overhear us, even though there was no one else around for miles. We tried to piece together what we'd seen. Where exactly it was, what it looked like, how it was standing. We figured it was between mile markers 159 and 156, somewhere in there. It was on a straight stretch of road, just before a slight curve to the left. There was a guardrail there, on the right side of the highway, and the thing was standing right behind it, maybe just a few feet back from the edge of the road. The road was straight there, so our headlights were shining right on that spot for a good long time. And the road was completely empty. No other cars, no traffic at all, just us and that thing, standing in the rain. I think it was getting ready to cross the road, Marcos said, his voice still low. I think it was waiting for us to pass, waiting for the road to be clear. That thought sent a fresh wave of chills down my spine. Waiting for us to pass. Why? What was it going to do? Cross the road to where? And what would have happened if we'd stopped? If we'd pulled over to get a better look? The thought made my stomach clench. Did you see its arms? I asked him. I think I saw its arms. They were long, really long. Yeah, he said. Long arms, hanging down by its sides. Almost down to its knees, it looked like. Long arms, 8 feet tall, dark fur, standing by the side of the highway in the middle of the night in the pouring rain. Just watching, waiting. We drove the rest of the way home in almost complete silence. The conversation about what we'd seen just seemed to die down. We were both too unsettled, too shaken up. It was like we'd opened a door to something we didn't understand, something we didn't want to understand, and we couldn't just close it again. The image of that creature standing there in the darkness, it was burned into my mind, into both our minds. We got home just before dawn, dragged ourselves inside, completely exhausted physically and emotionally. We didn't talk about it anymore that day. We didn't talk about it for days, actually. We just pretended it didn't happen, tried to push it to the back of our minds. But it's still there. It's always there at the edge of my thoughts. Every time I drive at night, every time I see headlights in the dark, I think about it. I think about that thing standing by the side of the road, watching us. I still can't explain it. I don't know what we saw. I don't want to know, maybe. All I know is it was real. It was there. We both saw it. And it changed something in both of us, especially in Marcos, the skeptic. Now he's different. He doesn't talk about it much, but I can see it in his eyes sometimes. That hint of something else. Like he knows there's more out there than we can explain. Like he knows we saw something that night that we weren't supposed to see. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that creature again. I try to picture it in my mind, standing there in the rain. And I wonder, what was it? What was it doing there? And is it still out there? Out there in the dark, watching? And the worst part is, I know deep down, we'll never really know. It's just out there. An unexplained thing, a glimpse into something other. And that's the part that really messes with you. The not knowing, the not understanding, the feeling that you saw something you weren't meant to see and that it saw you too. And then it was just gone. Vanished back into the darkness, leaving you with nothing but questions and a chill that goes right to your bones. And you're just left there, driving on, wondering what the hell just happened, and knowing somehow that you'll never really forget it, no matter how hard you try. Never. Story 9. Man, Where do I even start? This happened ages ago, like half a century ago now, if you can believe it. It's something I haven't really talked about much, not really, because how do you explain something that sounds completely insane without people looking at you like you've got screws loose? But seeing some of the stuff people are sharing online, I figured maybe there are folks out there who'd actually get it, or at least not think I'm making it all up. It was summer of '72, and Ohio summers back then were hot, real hot, sticky kind of heat that just hung in the air. I was 18, just messing around like any kid that age. My buddies Lucas and David, we were all bored out of our minds. You know how it is when school's out and you got nothing but time on your hands. We were driving around in my beat-up old Chevy, looking for something to do, some kind of adventure, even if it was just dumb teenage adventure. Someone mentioned this place near Rio Claro. Said it was out past Whitman Creek, land owned by Cleveland Illuminating. Apparently they used it as some kind of ash dump, all that stuff left over from burning coal to make electricity. But the word was, it was a pretty secluded spot, and locals went there to do some target shooting. We weren't really into guns, not seriously, but the idea of getting out in the middle of nowhere, away from everyone, that sounded good. So we drove out there, took some back roads, ended up on this dirt track that was kicking up dust like crazy. It was already hot as hell, even with the windows down. Finally, we pulled up to this area that didn't really look like much. Kind of barren, with these weird grey hills and piles all over the place. Definitely looked like some kind of industrial dump, not exactly scenic, but it was quiet. No houses, no people, just us, and the buzzing of insects and the sun beating down. We got out, stretched our legs. The air smelled weird, kind of dusty and a little bit like burnt something. Lucas had brought an old BB gun, just for messing around, and we figured we'd shoot at some cans or something. We started walking, kind of aimlessly, deeper into this area. The ground was uneven, all covered in this powdery grey stuff, ash, I guess. It crunched under our feet. The sun was reflecting off the light color, and it was almost blinding. We were walking for maybe 10-15 minutes, just talking nonsense, cracking jokes. We were probably about as loud and obnoxious as teenage boys could be, not paying much attention to anything really, just being dumb kids. And then, suddenly, it happened. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. More like something caught my eye, a movement, way off in the distance. I stopped walking. "Hey guys," I said, kind of low. "Look over there." Lucas and David stopped too and squinted in the direction I was pointing. It was maybe, I don't know, 75 yards away, maybe a little more. Out in this open area between two of the bigger ash mounds. At first, I couldn't make out what it was. Just something dark, kind of blurry in the heat haze. Then it moved again, and that's when I realized it wasn't an animal, and it definitely wasn't a person. It was standing, tall, real tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen, easily 7, maybe 8 feet tall. But it wasn't just the height. It was everything about it. It was wide, massive, built like a brick house, but tall and kind of hunched over at the same time. And it was dark, like a shadow, even in the bright sunlight. It was just standing there, perfectly still, but it was watching us. I could feel it, even from that distance. It was like its eyes were locked on us, and it was assessing us, like we were bugs under a microscope or something. My heart started hammering in my chest. I nudged Lucas, pointed again, a little more urgently. "Dude, do you see that?" Lucas's jaw dropped. David, who was usually the bravest one of us, his eyes went wide and he went completely silent. I could see the color draining out of his face. He whispered, barely audible, "What the hell?" We just stood there, frozen, staring at this thing. It hadn't moved. It was just there, menacing, intimidating. It was like something out of a nightmare, something you read about in a monster magazine, not something you actually see in broad daylight in Ohio. The thing was so bulky, it didn't look human at all. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, and its neck seemed thick, almost non-existent. Its arms looked long, hanging down to its sides, and it was just solid, immovable, like a statue made of shadow and muscle. Then it shifted, just slightly, but enough. It turned its head just a fraction, and I swear it was like it was confirming we were still there, still watching. And in that movement, I got a sense of intelligence, not human intelligence, something else, something colder, something predatory. That was it. That was the moment the fear really kicked in. It wasn't just surprise or confusion anymore. It was pure, raw terror. My legs went weak. I felt like I couldn't breathe properly. Lucas mumbled, "We gotta go, now." He didn't have to tell me twice. I spun around, adrenaline surging through me, and just started running. Full sprint, back the way we came. Lucas and David were right behind me. We didn't say a word. We just ran like our lives depended on it. Because in that moment, it felt like they did. Every sound, every rustle of the wind felt amplified, threatening. I kept expecting to hear something behind us, something following. But all I heard was our own ragged breathing and the pounding of our feet on the ashy ground. We didn't stop running until we were back at the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life. I threw the car into reverse, tires spitting gravel, and we tore out of there. We didn't slow down, not until we were miles away from that place, back on the main road, heading towards town. Then we just stopped, pulled over to the side of the road, all three of us breathing heavy, drenched in sweat, just staring straight ahead, not saying anything for a long, long time. Finally, Lucas spoke, his voice still shaky. Did you guys see that too? Or was I hallucinating? David and I just nodded, both of us still in shock. "I saw it," David said, voice barely a whisper. "I definitely saw it." We sat there for a while longer, trying to catch our breath, trying to process what we had just seen. It felt unreal, like it couldn't have been real, but we had all seen it, all three of us. We gotta tell someone," Lucas said eventually. "Someone needs to know." I was hesitant. Who were we going to tell? The cops? They'd laugh us out of the station, but Lucas was insistent. He kept saying, "What if it hurts someone? What if it's dangerous?" So we drove into town, found a payphone. Remember payphones? This was before cell phones, of course. Lucas made the call. He was so nervous he was stuttering when he spoke to the dispatcher. He tried to explain what we'd seen, this creature out by the old ash dump. The woman on the phone, she sounded annoyed, like we were wasting her time. She kept interrupting him, asking if we'd been drinking, if we were playing a prank. Lucas kept saying, "No, Mom, we're serious. We saw something really weird and big." Finally, she said she'd send an officer out to check it out, just to shut us up, I think. She gave us this sarcastic, "Sure, boys, we'll look for your monster." You could practically hear her rolling her eyes through the phone. We drove back to the edge of town and waited, parked by the side of the road, watching for the police car. It felt like hours, but it was probably only 20 minutes or so. Finally, a cruiser pulled up. A cop got out, young guy, probably not much older than us. He walked over to our car, this smirk on his face. "All right, boys," he said, leaning down, looking in at us. "Let's hear about this monster." He was definitely not taking us seriously. Lucas started to explain again, but the cop just cut him off. "Creature out by the ash dump, huh? Big and scary?" He chuckled. "Let me guess, it was green, had big teeth and wanted to steal your girlfriends." He was being a complete jerk, just mocking us. We were getting angry, but we were also still freaked out, so we tried to stay calm. We pointed him in the direction of the dirt track, told him where we'd seen it, about 75 yards into the field. He kept smirking, but he said, All right, I'll take a look, just to be sure you boys aren't seeing things." He got back in his car, drove down the dirt track a little ways, then parked. He got out, still with that cocky grin on his face, and started walking towards the field, in the direction we'd pointed. He didn't even bother to ask us to come with him. He clearly thought we were idiots. We watched him. We stayed by our car, parked on the side of the road, just watching. He walked further and further into the field, disappearing behind some of the ash mounds for a bit, then reappearing. He was still walking in the direction we'd said we'd seen it. Then he stopped. He was out there, maybe as far as we'd been when we saw the thing, maybe a little further, and he just stopped moving. We watched him, our hearts pounding again, but for a different reason this time. It wasn't fear for ourselves anymore. It was something else. Anticipation. Dread. He stood there, motionless, for what felt like forever. Then slowly he turned around and started walking back towards us. But something was different. The smirk was gone. Completely gone. His face was pale, grim. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. His eyes were wide, but not like he was scared in a comical way. It was a different kind of fear, a deep, unsettling fear. As he got closer, we could see his hand, his right hand. It was holding something, and then we realized what it was. His service revolver. It was out of its holster, unsheathed. He was holding it down by his side, but it was there, in his hand, ready. He walked right up to us, didn't say a word. He just looked at us, his face still white, still serious. The smirk, the sarcasm, all of it completely vanished. It was like he was a different person. He got in his cruiser without saying a single word to us and backed out onto the road. Then he just drove away. He didn't look back. He didn't say anything. He just left. We stood there, stunned, watching his taillights disappear down the road. What the hell had he seen? What had scared him so badly that he went from laughing at us to drawing his weapon and then just leaving without a word? We never saw him again. We never heard anything more about it from the police. The whole thing just disappeared. But it didn't disappear from our minds. Not ever. We talked about it, of course, Lucas, David, and me. We tried to make sense of it. We went back to that area a few times, but we never saw anything again. Just the ash, the heat, the silence. But the feeling that something was still there, watching, that never really went away. And that cop. That's what really gets to me, even now. Whatever he saw out there in that field, it changed him. It scared him. And he never said a word about it. He just drove away, leaving us with our fear, our confusion, and this unanswered question that's been hanging over us ever since. I still don't know what we saw that day. Some animal, some thing, I have no idea, but I know what I saw. We all saw it. And I know for damn sure that cop saw something too, something that scared the living daylights out of him, and that's something I can't explain, something I'll probably never forget, and honestly, it still chills me to the bone just thinking about it. Story 10. Okay, so this happened back in July of 2016. Me, my wife, our teenage daughter, and our little boy decided to go camping. We live in Bomjardim, and we wanted to get out in nature, do something different, you know. I'm a firefighter, Andre, by the way, so I'm not exactly scared of much. Or at least, I didn't think I was. We picked Lago Salgado State Park. Looked nice online, and we wanted to try out the Morro Morgan Trail. Seemed like a good little adventure for the family. We got to the park, set up our camp, nothing out of the ordinary, just your regular family camping stuff. The morning was pretty standard. We packed some snacks, water, sunscreen, all the usual hiking gear, and headed to the Morro Morgan Trail. It was sunny, typical July day, kinda hot but bearable. The trail entrance looked inviting enough. Trees all around, the usual forest smell. We started walking, and pretty soon we crossed paths with another couple coming back from further down the trail. They were smiling, looked a bit tired but happy. Just typical hikers. We asked them if they'd gone all the way to the top. They said no, not really. And then the guy, he kind of hesitated for a second and said, "You know, it's a bit weird further in. Lots of broken trees and branches bent over, like in arches, down further anyway." He didn't seem bothered by it, more like just mentioning it in passing. Now, I don't know, something about the way he said it, weird, and the image of bent trees, it just gave me this feeling. Not exactly fear, more like a prickle at the back of my neck. Intuition, maybe? I've learned to trust those feelings. So we kept walking, but those words kinda stayed with me. As we walked further in, maybe 10, 15 minutes, I started to notice what they were talking about. Here and there, you'd see a smaller tree snapped clean off, or bigger branches twisted and hanging down. Not like normal storm damage. These breaks looked intentional almost, like something had just grabbed and twisted them. And yeah, some of the branches were bent over in these weird arches. It wasn't a lot, just sporadic, but enough to be noticeable. My wife, she didn't say anything, but I could tell she was picking up on my vibe. The kids were just kids, pointing at bugs and chattering away, totally oblivious. But I was getting more and more uneasy. I started thinking about the top of Morro Morgan. I remembered seeing pictures online, picnic tables, an open area. But suddenly, the idea of hiking all the way up there, deep into the woods, it just didn't sit right with me anymore. I stopped us for a water break. "You know what?" I said, trying to sound casual. "I'm not really feeling the hike to the top today. How about we just walk a bit more here, then turn around and go swim in the lake instead? It's hot anyway." My wife looked at me, probably sensed something was up, but she just nodded. "Swimming sounds great," she said. The kids cheered. Swimming always wins. So, that was it. We walked a little further, maybe another 10 minutes, and I just said, "Okay, let's head back." We turned around, and honestly, I felt a wave of relief washing over me. Dumb, maybe. It wasn't like anything had actually happened, but that gut feeling was strong. We spent the rest of the afternoon swimming in the lake, the kids splashing around having a blast. We ate some sandwiches, just normal family time. By late afternoon, we were packing up our swim gear to head back to camp. The sun was starting to go down a little, the light getting that golden hour glow. As we drove back towards our campsite, we passed the entrance to the Morro Morgan Trail again, and I just got this sudden, crazy idea. "Hey," I said to my wife, "remember those pine trees right at the entrance of the trail? They looked really cool in the afternoon light. Let's stop and take a family photo in front of them, just a quick one." Again, looking back, what was I thinking? But in the moment, it just seemed like a nice idea. A pretty photo to remember the day. My wife agreed, why not? So, I pulled into the parking area for the trail. As we were slowing down to park, bam! Out of nowhere, a bunch of deer burst out of the pine trees on the side of the road, right in front of our car. They were running like crazy, eyes wide, absolutely panicked. I slammed on the brakes, tires screeching. We swerved a bit, narrowly avoided hitting them. It was a close call. My heart was pounding. "Jesus!" my wife gasped, clutching her chest. The kids were startled, asking what happened. "Deer," I said, my voice a little shaky. "They just ran right out." We watched as the deer disappeared down the road, still running full tilt. It was so sudden, so violent, and so unnatural. Deer aren't usually that spooked by cars, especially in a park. I parked the car finally. The parking lot was completely empty now. The sun was definitely starting to set, casting long shadows. The other hikers from earlier were long gone. There was a stillness in the air that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. Sinister even. Yeah, that's the word. Sinister quiet. We got out of the car. The air felt cooler now, the temperature dropping with the fading light. We started walking towards the entrance of the trail, to those pine trees. They did look beautiful in the evening light, tall and dark green against the orange sky. But the feeling in the air, it was wrong. dead wrong. And then the sounds started. First, it was just a single thump, like someone hitting a tree trunk with a heavy piece of wood. Thump, echoing from deep within the pine forest. Then another thump, closer this time. Thump, thump. Each sound resonating in the silence, amplified by the dense trees. My wife stopped dead in her tracks. "What's that?" she whispered, her voice tight. I froze too, listening. The hairs on my arms stood up. It wasn't an animal sound. It wasn't natural. Then came the snapping. Loud, sharp cracks, branches breaking, twigs splintering. Not just small twigs, but thick branches, the kind you'd have to really work to break. And it wasn't the sound of wind. There wasn't any wind. It was deliberate, forceful. Snap, crack, and then the really terrifying sound. A deep, groaning creak, followed by a deafening crash. A tree, a big tree, falling in the woods. The ground vibrated slightly beneath our feet. The crash echoed through the trees, then silence again. But a different silence now. A waiting silence. My wife's voice was barely a whisper now. "Andre, what is that?" Her eyes were wide with fear, locked on the dark tree line. The kids, finally sensing the shift in atmosphere, were clinging to our legs, suddenly silent and scared. I don't know," I said, my voice low, almost a growl, "but I don't think we should go in there." My firefighter training kicked in. Assess the situation, prioritize safety, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there. But we were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear and disbelief. Just then, another crash, closer this time, and then the footsteps, heavy, slow, deliberate, like something huge was walking through the woods, breaking branches underfoot, each step sending tremors through the ground. Thump, thump, thump. Getting closer, moving parallel to the trail inside the trees. Flanking us, I snapped. "Run!" I yelled, adrenaline surging. "Get back to the car, now!" I grabbed my son's hand. My wife grabbed our daughter. We turned and ran, back towards the parking lot, not even thinking, just pure instinct. Terror propelled us. As we scrambled back, I glanced back towards the trail entrance, just for a split second. And that's when I saw it. A thick, heavy branch lying right across the trail entrance, right where we would have walked in to take our photo. It hadn't been there before. I swear on my life it hadn't. I would have noticed it. It was too big to miss. It looked like it had been placed there, deliberately blocking the way, like a barrier. That branch, that image seared itself into my brain. It was like a warning, a message. Stay out. We piled into the car, doors slamming, heartbeats hammering in our chests. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. Started the engine, tires spinning as I reversed out of the parking spot, not caring about anything but getting away. We sped out of there, back onto the main park road, not slowing down until we were miles away, driving in complete silence, just the hum of the engine and our ragged breaths. We didn't say anything to each other until we got back to our campsite. The other campers were making dinner, laughing, completely oblivious to whatever we had just experienced. We just went straight into our tent, zipped it closed. The kids were still wide-eyed, scared, asking questions in hushed voices. My wife was pale, her hands still trembling. I couldn't even speak. That night, I didn't sleep a wink. I just lay there in the dark, the sounds from the woods replaying in my head, the thumps, the snaps, the crashes, the heavy footsteps, and that branch, that damned branch across the trail. I kept seeing it in my mind's eye. What was it? What was in those woods? And why did it want us out? I don't know. I have no logical explanation. We didn't see anything, not really, but I felt it. I felt the presence, the power, the anger. It was like something ancient, something territorial. We packed up camp first thing the next morning, skipped breakfast, didn't even say goodbye to anyone. Just loaded everything into the car and drove home. We haven't been back to Lago Salgado State Park since. And honestly, I don't think I ever will. People might say it was animals, maybe a bear or, I don't know, a really big, angry raccoon throwing branches around. But it wasn't animals. It felt different, intelligent in a way, malicious even. To this day, when I think about that evening at Morrow Morgan Trail, I still get chills, that feeling of pure, primal fear. It stays with you, and the image of that branch, it haunts me. Like we were given a chance, a warning, and we took it, just ran, and never looked back. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't. If we'd ignored that feeling, kept walking, taken that photo. I don't want to know. Some things are better left undisturbed, hidden in the dark woods, and that's something I learned that day. Something in those woods didn't want us there, and it made damn sure we knew it. Story 11. It was back in the 40s, see. I was just a kid, 7 years old maybe, something like that. We lived up in Cherokee Ridge. My mum, she was all about making do, living off the land, you know. Summers were spent canning, preserving and foraging for anything we could eat or trade. Blackberries were a big deal. They grew wild all over those hills, thick and juicy. So every year, when they were ripe, we'd all troop out there, buckets in hand, Mom leading the way, me and my brothers trailing behind like little ducklings. One day, we were deeper in the woods than usual. We'd been picking for hours. The sun was hot, and our buckets were getting heavy. Mom was humming some old tune, her face sweaty but smiling. My brothers were off somewhere, probably wrestling or something stupid boys do. I was closer to Mom, picking berries on a slope, when she pointed up ahead. "John!" she called out, her voice echoing a little in the quiet woods. That was my older brother. "Go ask that man what time it is. We need to head back soon if we want to beat the heat." I saw him then, sitting on a fallen log further up the hill. Just a shape at first, kind of blurry in the distance. He was just sitting there, still as a statue. John grumbled, 'cause he was always grumpy, but he went. We watched him walk towards the figure, get closer, and then stop. He just stood there for a minute looking. Then he turned around and practically ran back to us, face all pale and eyes wide. "Mom," he gasped, out of breath. "Mom, you go. Mariana should go." He was talking all jerky like he was about to cry. Mom frowned. "What are you talking about, John? What's wrong?" Just you send Mariana," he insisted, still panting. He wouldn't look back up the hill, wouldn't say what had spooked him, just kept staring at the ground. Mom, she was always firm, you know, didn't take nonsense. But she must have seen something in John's face, 'cause she didn't argue, she just nodded at me. "Go on, Mariana. Go ask the man the time." Me? I was confused, scared even seeing John like that. "But you didn't disobey Mom. Not ever." So I started walking towards the figure on the log. My heart was thumping in my chest, a fast, nervous beat. The closer I got, the bigger he seemed to be. He was large, heavy-set, and still, completely still. He was wearing clothes, I could see that now, dark clothes like pants and maybe a jacket, all rough and brown-looking. I stopped a little ways off, my voice shaky. "Sir?" I said. "Excuse me, sir?" No response. He was just staring down at the ground, head slightly bowed like he was studying the dirt. "Sir," I said again, louder this time. "My mom wants to know what time it is." Still nothing, like he couldn't hear me, like I wasn't even there. I stepped closer, really close now, right beside him. I could smell him then, a strange smell, musky and earthy, like damp leaves and something else, something animal. Not like farm animals, like wild animal, and he was big. So big. His shoulders were hunched and wide, and even sitting down he seemed massive. I could see the side of his face now. Rough skin, dark and kind of leathery, and hairy, really hairy. Not like beard hair, but fur. Thick, dark fur covering the side of his face, his neck, even the back of his hands that were resting on his knees. I reached out, scared, but also, I don't know, compelled. I had to get his attention. I stretched out my hand and poked him on the arm. just a little poke. "Sir?" I asked again, my voice barely a whisper now. "What time is it, please?" And then he moved. It was slow at first, agonizingly slow, like something waking up after a long sleep. His head started to lift, and as it came up, I saw his face. And it wasn't a man's face, it was monstrous, covered in thick, matted fur like the rest of him. The nose was flat and broad, with wide nostrils that seemed to flare slightly. The mouth was wide too, stretching almost to his ears, with thick, dark lips, and I didn't see teeth, not really, just darkness inside. And the eyes, they were small and deep-set, almost hidden under thick, bushy brows, and they were yellow, a dull, murky yellow like old pennies. He didn't speak. He didn't even look at me, not directly. Those yellow eyes just seemed to stare right through me, through the trees, at something far, far away. But he stood up, and he was huge, towers over me, towers over anything I'd ever seen. He was like a tree come to life, a hairy, muscled, towering thing, and as he stood, that smell got stronger, that musky, wild animal smell. It filled my nose, choked my breath. I just stood there, frozen, staring up at him, my little hand still outstretched like I was going to shake his paw or something crazy. Then, without a word, without a sound, without even looking at me, he just turned and started walking down the hill, away from me, away from my family, just lumbered down the slope, his heavy feet crunching on the leaves and twigs. He disappeared into the trees, and I stood there, rooted to the spot, heart hammering, breath catching in my throat. I turned and stumbled back down the hill, tripping over roots and branches until I reached Mom. She saw my face, pale and tear-streaked, I guess. "Mariana, what happened? What did he say?" I just shook my head, unable to speak. Couldn't find the words for what I'd seen, for what I felt. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, a sense of wrongness, like the world had shifted a little and things weren't quite right anymore. We went home. John didn't say anything either, just kept quiet and jumpy. Mom kept asking, but we couldn't explain. Not really, not something you could put into words. I just knew, deep down, that what I'd seen wasn't a man, not a normal man anyway. Years went by, we grew up, moved on with our lives. The memory faded a little, got pushed to the back of my mind. Just a weird thing that happened once when I was a kid. Until it happened again. I was older then, a young woman, still living in the area, helping Mom out with the house. It was blackberry season again, and we went back to Cherokee Ridge. Not the exact same spot, but close. We were picking in a sunny clearing, buckets filling up nicely, chatting and laughing, just enjoying the day. Then I saw them, 2 of them, just like the first one. Across the clearing, deeper in the bushes, picking blackberries. They were bulky figures, bent over, moving slowly, their dark shapes contrasting with the green leaves and bright sunlight. My heart stopped. The air went cold. It all came rushing back, that feeling of wrongness, that cold dread. Mum saw them too. "Hey!" she yelled, her voice sharp and annoyed. "Get out of here! Those are our berries! You can't just come here and steal our berries!" They didn't react, didn't turn, didn't stop picking, just kept going like they hadn't heard her. Mom got mad then. She was protective of her berry patches like they were gold. "Mariana," she said, her voice firm, "go tell them to leave. Tell them these are our berries, and they need to find their own patch." Me? My stomach was in knots. I didn't want to go near them, not again. But Mum was watching, expecting, and something in me, maybe just stubborn pride, made me take a step forward. I walked towards them, my legs feeling stiff and heavy. As I got closer, I saw them more clearly. 2 of them, just as big and hairy as the first one, wearing those same rough, dark clothes, smelling the same musky, wild animal scent. They were picking berries and eating them, stuffing handfuls into their mouths, their thick lips smacking and moving. They looked like animals trying to act like people. It was unsettling, deeply unsettling. I stopped a few feet away, my voice trembling but trying to sound strong. "Excuse me," I said. "These are our berry patches. My mother says you need to leave." They stopped then. They straightened up, slowly, heavily. They turned to face me. And again those yellow eyes, 2 pairs of them now, staring at me from those furry faces. They didn't speak. They didn't make a sound. They just looked at me, those cold yellow eyes fixed on mine, and then they turned, just like the first one had done years ago. They turned and walked away, into the trees, deeper into the woods. They didn't run. They didn't argue. They just left. Mom came over, hands on her hips. "Well," she asked, "did you tell them off?" I nodded, still shaky. "Yeah," I said, "they went. But Mom, they weren't people. They weren't right." She frowned, looking towards the trees where they'd disappeared. "Nonsense, Mariana. They were probably just some of those hill people, you know? Quiet folk. Don't want any trouble." But I knew better. Deep down, I knew. It wasn't just the fur, or the smell, or the eyes. It was something else, something instinctual. They weren't human, not in the way we were. Then came Uncle Jorge and his sheep. Uncle Jorge was Mom's brother, a good man, always trying to make a go of things. He decided to raise sheep up in Cherokee Ridge. Figured it'd be a good business, wool and meat and all that. He built fences, bought a flock, got himself set up. For a while it went well. Sheep grazed, lambs were born, life was normal. Farm life. Then the killings started. First, it was just 2 sheep. Found them one morning in the pasture. Torn apart. Horribly, brutally torn apart, like some kind of animal attack. But worse, much worse. Their insides were ripped out, scattered around, blood everywhere. It was a mess, a terrible, sickening mess. And the strangest thing? Their livers were gone, just vanished. Nothing else taken, just the livers. Uncle Jorge was distraught. Lost sheep were bad enough, but this was different. This was vicious. He figured it was wild dogs maybe, or coyotes gone crazy. He started patrolling the pasture at night, rifle in hand, watching for anything. Then it happened again, and again, and again. Worse each time. Not just 2 sheep, but 5, then 10, then 15. Whole sections of his flock just slaughtered. The same gruesome scene. Torn bodies, entrails ripped out, livers missing. Terror spread through the farm, through the whole family. It wasn't just the money he was losing, it was the sheer horror of it. The senseless violence and the livers. Why just the livers? Uncle Jorge called in some expert from the state agriculture department. Man came out, looked at the carcasses, walked the pasture, scratched his head. Said he'd never seen anything like it. Said it wasn't dogs, wasn't coyotes, wasn't any animal he could recognize. Too clean, too brutal, too focused. And the livers, he just kept shaking his head about the livers. Like something deliberately chose them, he said, like they were delicacies. The sheep business was ruined, just wiped out. Uncle Jorge had to sell off what was left of his flock, take a massive loss. It broke his heart, but it didn't stop there. It moved to the cattle. First, it was a calf, a young, healthy calf, found dead in the barn, same terrible condition as the sheep, torn open insides out, liver gone. Then, a few weeks later, a cow, a big, strong dairy cow, and it was even worse with the cow. Bigger body, bigger mess, more blood, more horror. But this time they'd gone for her udders too, mutilated, ripped, torn apart, like they were feeding on them. Along with the liver, of course. Uncle Jorge was terrified, beyond terrified. He was living in a nightmare. He didn't know what was killing his animals. He didn't know why. He just knew it was something unnatural, something evil. He had to protect what was left. He had a few cows left, some chickens. He wasn't going to lose them too. So he started watching the barn at night, Armed, always armed. He'd climb up into the old apple tree that grew right next to the barn, hide in the branches, and watch. Night after night. Cold nights, dark nights, moonlit nights. He watched and waited, sleep and fear keeping him company. Third night he saw something. Just after midnight, moon hidden behind the clouds, darkest dark you can imagine. He heard rustling in the bushes near the barn. Soft at first, then louder, closer, then a shadow moved. A dark shape, hulking, humanoid, moving towards the barn door. He didn't hesitate. Fear and desperation took over. He raised his rifle, aimed at the dark shape, and fired. The sound exploded in the night, echoing through the hills, and then a scream. Not human scream. Higher pitched, sharper, more animalistic, but still a scream of pain. A piercing, awful shriek that made your blood run cold. The dark shape jerked, stumbled, and then ran. Fled into the woods, crashing through the undergrowth, the scream fading into the distance. Uncle Jorge scrambled down from the tree, heart pounding, rifle shaking in his hands. He ran to the barn, pushed open the heavy wooden door, and went inside. The smell hit him first. That same musky, wild animal smell, but stronger now, thicker, mixed with something else, something metallic. Blood. There was blood on the barn floor. A lot of it. Dark, thick pools of it, leading towards the open door. He followed the trail of blood out into the yard, into the edge of the woods. Then it stopped. Just vanished. As if whatever he'd shot had just disappeared into thin air. He searched. All night, all morning. He called in neighbors. They searched too. They scoured the woods, combed the hillsides, looked in ravines and creeks. Nothing, no body, no trace of what he'd shot. He even went to the local hospitals, asked if anyone had come in with gunshot wounds. Nothing. It was like the thing had just vanished. Then came the smokehouse. Uncle Jorge had a small smokehouse behind the barn where he cured meat. Hams, bacon, sausages, stuff like that. After the shootings, after the search came up empty, he started noticing things missing from the smokehouse. Meat, cured and smoked meat, just gone. Doors were locked, but they'd be open in the morning. Meat gone, locks untouched. He put stronger locks on, padlocks, chains. Didn't matter. Meat kept disappearing. Then, one night it was worse. He went out to the smokehouse in the morning to get some bacon for breakfast. And the smokehouse door was gone, ripped clean off its hinges. Thick wooden door, heavy hinges just torn away, like it was nothing. And the smokehouse was empty. Everything gone. That was the last straw. Uncle Jorge, he couldn't take it anymore. He sold the farm, took what little money he could get, packed up his family and left. Just left Cherokee Ridge behind. Never went back. And me? I'm still here. Still in the area. Still remember it all like it was yesterday. The man on the log, the creatures in the berry patch, the slaughtered sheep, the blood in the barn, the ripped-off smokehouse door. I know what we saw. I know what Uncle Jorge shot. And it wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something else, something in between. To this day, I can't explain it. Nobody can. And that's the part that chills you to the bone, you know. Not just the fear, not just the horror, but the unknowableness of it all. The feeling that there are things out there in the woods, in the hills, things we can't understand, can't control, can't even name. And sometimes they watch us. Sometimes they take what they want. And sometimes they just leave you with the fear. And that fear, that's the thing that stays with you. That's the thing that never really goes away. I still look at the woods different now, still hear noises at night, and I don't know. I just know I'll never forget. Never. Story 12. Across the road from my house was Big Branch Marsh National Wildlife Refuge. Basically just endless woods and swamp. It was beautiful during the day, birds chirping, all that nature stuff. But at night, man, it was a different story. All kinds of sounds came out of those woods. Most of the time it was just normal animal noises, you know. Crickets, frogs, owls hooting. But sometimes you'd hear things that just didn't sound like anything you could put your finger on. Weird, rustling, cracking branches, sometimes almost like a low growl, but far away. Anyway, that night I was on the porch, just chilling after dinner, talking to my mom on my cell. Nothing special, just catching up, you know how moms are. She was telling me about her garden, and I was swatting mosquitoes and watching the fireflies blink on and off in my yard. It was peaceful in a way, hot as hell, but peaceful. I was facing the woods because that's where the breeze usually came from, if there was any breeze at all. My mom was rambling on about tomato plants or something, and I was only half listening. That's when I saw it. At first, I just thought it was a shadow, you know, playing tricks in the dim light. My porch light was on, but it didn't reach very far past the yard. The woods across the street were pitch black. But then, this shadow moved, and it wasn't a shadow like a tree branch swaying. It was like something solid moving in the dark. It came out of the edge of the woods, maybe 15 yards from where I was sitting, just stepped out of the trees like it was nothing, and it was big, really big. My breath hitched. I stopped listening to my mom completely. I could feel my heart starting to pound in my chest. I stared, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was tall, way taller than any person. I'm guessing around 7 feet, maybe more, and it was covered in hair, dark hair, shaggy and thick. It was walking upright like a man, but it definitely wasn't a man. It just walked out of the woods like it owned the place and started crossing the road. It didn't hurry. It didn't look around. It just walked. And it was deliberate. That's the word that comes to mind. Like it knew exactly where it was going and wasn't afraid of anything. I watched it cross the street, and I'm telling you, this was a normal 2-lane road, nothing huge. It crossed it in 3, maybe 4 strides. Long strides. Its legs were powerful. You could see the muscles even under the hair. It wasn't running, but it moved fast. Way too fast for something that big to be moving like that. And the way it walked, it was kind of hunched over, not perfectly straight like a person. Its shoulders were massive, broad as anything I'd ever seen. Its arms hung down past its knees, long and thick, and its hands... I didn't get a real clear look at its hands, but they looked big too. Claw-like almost. My mind was racing. What the hell was I looking at? Bear? But bears don't walk like that, do they? And they definitely aren't 7 feet tall and covered head to toe in thick, dark hair. It was like something out of a nightmare. It reached my side of the road and started walking between the houses. Not towards my house, thankfully, but towards my neighbor's place down the street. There are only a few houses on my road, spread out pretty far apart. My neighbor, Mr. Dubois, lived maybe 100 yards down from me. Old guy, usually goes to bed early. Terror. That's the only word for what I felt. Just pure, icy terror. My throat went dry, and my hands started to shake. I was frozen to my chair, just watching this thing walk down the road. It was getting closer to Mr. Dubois' house. I could see it clearer now, even in the darkness. The porch light from my other neighbor's house down the road was casting a little bit of light, enough to make out details. Its skin, it looked dark, like really dark brown or black under the hair. The hair was thick and matted, not clean and fluffy like a bear. And its head, that was the worst part. It didn't have a snout like a dog or a wolf. That was the first thing that struck me. My neighbor later told me about the rougarou, the werewolf thing, and said it had a dog or wolf head. But this didn't. It was more human-shaped, but wrong, distorted, heavy brow ridge, kind of pushed-in nose, if that makes sense. Like a gorilla's face, but bigger. And those eyes, oh God, those eyes. They were black, just completely black. No white, no pupil, just 2 black pits staring straight ahead, and it looked right at me as it crossed the road. Just for a second, but it locked eyes with me. And there was something in those eyes. Intelligence. Cold, calculating intelligence. It wasn't just an animal. This thing was thinking. It knew what it was doing. And it didn't care that I was watching it. That's what really freaked me out. It just didn't care, like it was saying, "Yeah, I'm here. So what?" I don't know how long I sat there, frozen like a statue, staring at it as it walked down the road. Maybe seconds, maybe minutes. It felt like forever. Finally, it disappeared between Mr. Dubois' house and the next house down the road, swallowed by the darkness and the trees again. That's when I snapped. I jumped up from my chair, phone still clutched in my hand. "Mom! Mom! Something just walked past my house." I was practically screaming into the phone. My voice was shaking so bad I could barely get the words out. My mom, bless her heart, immediately went into panic mode. "What? What is it? Are you okay? Did someone break in?" No, it's not a person. It's some kind of creature, big, hairy, like a monster, Mom, I swear to God." I ran inside, slamming the porch door shut and locking it, then locking the front door too. I went into the living room, heart still pounding in my chest, peeking out the windows, pulling back the curtains just a little, trying to see if it was still out there. Nothing. Just darkness and shadows, and the rustling of the wind in the trees. I was pacing back and forth, telling my mom everything I'd seen, describing the creature as best as I could. She was trying to calm me down, telling me I must have imagined it, that it was probably just a bear or maybe a deer. But I knew what I saw, and it wasn't a bear or a deer. It was something else, something primal, something terrifying. "Mom, it walked upright like a man, and it was huge, and those eyes... You wouldn't believe those eyes. It was staring right at me. I'm telling you, it was real." She finally started to realize I wasn't making it up, that I was genuinely terrified. She told me to stay inside, to lock all the doors and windows, and she'd call my uncle, who lived closer to me than she did. He had a gun, she said, and he could come over and check things out. I stayed up all night, couldn't sleep a wink. Every little noise outside made me jump. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the house sounded like it was back, coming for me. I kept checking the windows, peering out into the darkness, half expecting to see those black eyes staring back at me. The next day, as soon as it was light out, I went outside, hesitantly. Everything looked normal. Sun was shining, birds were singing, like nothing had happened, except I couldn't shake the image of that creature from my mind. I decided to talk to my neighbors. Mr. Dubois was outside watering his flowers when I went over to his place. He was surprised to see me so early. "Hey, Lisa, everything all right?" he asked, looking at me kind of funny, probably because I looked like I hadn't slept in days. I took a deep breath and told him what I'd seen the night before. About the tall, hairy creature walking upright, crossing the road. I expected him to laugh, to tell me I was crazy, but he didn't. He listened to me quietly, nodding slowly as I described it. When I was finished, he just sighed and shook his head. "Rougarou," he said. Just like that. Like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Rougarou," I repeated, confused. "What's a rougarou?" "Down here in the bayou," he said, "we call it rougarou. Up north they call it werewolf, some places Bigfoot. Same thing, different name." He told me about the legend of the rougarou, a creature that roams the swamps and woods, part man, part wolf. He said people had seen it around here for generations, mostly just glimpses, shadows in the trees, strange tracks. But sometimes they got a closer look. He said he'd never seen it himself, not clearly anyway. He'd heard things, though. Strange sounds at night, animals acting spooked, things disappearing from porches, things I'd started noticing myself lately. Little things, flower pots knocked over, a garden gnome I had on the porch, gone. I just brushed it off as animals or kids messing around. Now I wasn't so sure. Other neighbors chimed in too as word spread. Old Mrs. Guidry said she hadn't sat on her porch after dark in years. Ever since she heard stories about the rougarou from her grandpa, they all seemed to know about it, accept it almost, and they were all scared of it. Terrified, really. They said that's why the dogs sometimes went crazy at night, barking their heads off, and then suddenly silence, like something shut them up, forcibly. And they talked about strange noises coming from the woods late at night. Sounds they couldn't explain. Chattering, they called it. Like it was talking in some language they couldn't understand. Arguments even, or someone scolding someone else. That chattering, that hit me hard, because I'd heard that. Just a few nights before, I'd been out on the porch late, unable to sleep, and I'd heard this weird noise coming from the woods, like muffled voices, too far away to make out words, but definitely sounds of speech. I dismissed it as kids messing around in the woods, even though it was late. But now I remembered something else. Before I'd seen the creature that night when I was talking to my mom, the dogs in the neighborhood had been barking like crazy, like they always did at night. But then, suddenly, they all went silent. Dead silent. Just before the creature stepped out of the trees. It was like they knew it was there and they were too scared to bark anymore. Or something worse had happened to them. The way Mr. Dubois and the others talked about it, it wasn't like they were telling a fun ghost story. It was real for them. This rougarou, this creature, was a real thing in their lives, something to be feared and avoided. And after what I'd seen, I wasn't arguing with them. I believed them. I had to. I still don't know what it was. Rougarou, Bigfoot, skunk ape, whatever you want to call it. Lisa's description, they said, matched a skunk ape more than a rougarou, since it didn't have a wolf's head. But labels don't matter much when you've seen something like that with your own eyes. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. Something that looks at you, and you know deep down it's not just an animal. It's been years since that night. I moved away from Lacombe not long after. Couldn't stand being there anymore. Every shadow in the woods looked like it. Every night sound made me jump. I still think about it sometimes, wonder what it was, what it wanted. Wonder if it's still out there in those woods, watching, listening, waiting. And you know what? To this day, I still can't explain that sound, that chattering from the woods. It wasn't animals, I know that for sure. And thinking about those black eyes, those eyes that looked right through me, it still gives me chills. I've tried to rationalize it, tell myself it was a hallucination, some kind of trick of the light, anything, but I know what I saw. And I know I'll never forget it. It was real, and that's the scariest part of all. It was real, and it just walked away. And I have no idea why, or where it went, or if it's still out there. Bye, Story 13. Anyway, I was dead asleep, completely conked out. Window was open because, well, it was August, and the air conditioning in this old place is a joke. Mostly just blows hot air around. So I'm out, right? And then bam! Total chaos erupts. It was Duke, our cocker spaniel. He started barking, not just a regular bark, like someone's at the door kind of bark. This was frantic, high-pitched, almost desperate barking, like he was terrified, but also super agitated. He was going absolutely nuts. It jolted me awake, heart pounding already. I sat straight up in bed, trying to figure out what the heck was going on. My bedroom's upstairs, and Duke's usually downstairs at night. He sleeps in the kitchen, you know, has his bed there. The barking was coming from right below me, through the floor. It was loud, really loud. I could hear my son, Mark, stirring in his room next door too. He's 15, pretty much sleeps through anything usually, so I knew it had to be something serious to wake him up like that. I threw on a robe, feeling my way in the dark, still half asleep and totally disoriented. The barking downstairs was just getting more intense, more panicked. It wasn't stopping at all. I got to the top of the stairs and could hear Duke scratching at the kitchen door. He does that when he needs to go out to pee, usually in the morning. But it wasn't morning. It was pitch black outside. I went down the stairs, slowly, carefully. Every creak of the wood felt super loud in the middle of the night, with Duke's barking filling the house. Got to the bottom, and I could see the kitchen door was slightly shaking from him, throwing himself against it, trying to get out. Okay, boy, I'm coming," I mumbled, still groggy. I flipped on the kitchen light and Duke went even more nuts. He was right at the door, practically climbing it, barking like his life depended on it. His eyes were wide, and I could see the whites of them. He was definitely freaked out. I unlocked the door and opened it. Duke shot out like a rocket, just bolted straight out into the yard. I was expecting him to just run to his usual pea spot, by the big oak tree. But he didn't. He went tearing off across the grass towards the shed. We have this old shed out back, kind of falling apart, really. We keep garden tools and junk in it. It's not that far from the house, maybe like 50 feet, not even that maybe. And Duke, he ran right to it and stopped dead. Then he started barking again, even louder than before. He was facing the shed, barking into the darkness around it, like there was something there, something he was really, really upset about. I stood there in the doorway, watching him, trying to see what he was barking at. It was so dark. No moon that night, just black. The only light was spilling out from the kitchen window behind me. I couldn't see anything by the shed, just darkness and trees beyond. The woods start right behind the shed, pretty dense woods. And then it happened. It was so sudden, so unexpected that I almost jumped out of my skin. Duke was barking his head off, right? And then, abruptly, it stopped. His bark just cut off mid-air. Silence. Just the crickets chirping, which now sounded ridiculously loud all of a sudden after Duke's barking. And then, this sound. I don't even know how to describe it properly. Like, imagine the loudest, angriest, most terrifying roar you can think of, but not like a lion or a bear, more primal, guttural, like it came from the depths of the earth itself. Someone described it once, ages ago, and it stuck with me. They said it sounded like a giant chimpanzee enraged. Yeah, that's kind of close, but even that doesn't quite capture it. It was deeper than that, more monstrous. This sound, this scream, erupted from right where Duke was barking near the shed. It was so loud it vibrated through the ground, through me. It echoed in my ears like it was inside my head. It wasn't just loud, it was wrong, completely unnatural. Like nothing human, nothing I'd ever heard before in my life. Pure, unfiltered rage and something else. Something truly evil, maybe. I don't know how else to put it. It went on for a few seconds, this ear-splitting, bone-chilling scream. And then it stopped as suddenly as it started, and in the sudden silence that followed I heard more. Other sounds. Not as loud, but growls, snarls, like something was fighting, scuffling around in the dark by the shed. It was hard to tell exactly what it was, but it was definitely not good, not normal. I was frozen in the doorway, paralyzed with fear. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My breath was coming in short gasps. I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring into the blackness, listening. Then Duke came tearing back into the house. He was whimpering now, low, pathetic whimpers. His tail was tucked so far between his legs it was practically touching his belly. He was shaking all over. He scrambled back inside, right past me, and bolted into the living room, disappearing behind the couch. He wasn't barking anymore. He was just terrified, completely and utterly terrified. And then Mark came stumbling into the kitchen. He was in his pajamas, hair all messed up, eyes wide with fear. "Mom? What was that? What's going on?" His voice was trembling. I don't know," I whispered, my voice barely working. "I don't know, honey." I was still staring at the doorway, at the darkness beyond. The sounds from outside had stopped again. Just silence. Except now, I could smell something else. It was disgusting, foul, like rotting meat, but worse, mixed with something else. Like sewage, just pure filth and decay. This wave of nauseating stink just rolled into the kitchen, thick and heavy. It was overpowering, instantly making my stomach churn. Mark coughed and gagged, covering his nose with his shirt. I had to turn away, holding my own breath. "What is that smell?" Mark choked out, his eyes watering. "I don't know. I repeated, still whispering, fear making my voice tight. I don't know. But I was starting to feel really, really sick. Not just from the smell, but from the pure terror of it all. The screams, the sounds in the dark, this awful smell. It all felt wrong. So deeply, fundamentally wrong. We stood there, huddled in the kitchen doorway, Mark and I, just staring into the black yard, listening, smelling this horrific stench. Duke was still whimpering behind the couch. Everything was silent outside again, except for the crickets, which still chirped on, oblivious to whatever horror had just unfolded in our backyard. Then another scream, not as loud as the first one, but still terrifying, more of a drawn-out, agonized shriek. And then another one, and another, shorter, sharper, like yelps, but deep, guttural yelps, if that makes sense. Not like an animal in pain exactly, more like an animal in torment, or something pretending to be an animal in torment. I don't know. It's hard to explain. They were unearthly. Definitely not anything I'd ever heard an animal make before. It was like something was being tortured, or something was torturing something else. And the smell just got worse, stronger. It was like it was seeping into the house, filling every corner, choking us. "Mom, I'm scared," Mark whispered, his voice cracking. He was clinging to my arm, shaking. He's not usually scared easily, Mark. He's a pretty tough kid. But he was genuinely terrified. And honestly, so was I. Beyond terrified. I was petrified. I felt like I was in some kind of nightmare, but I knew I wasn't. This was real. Whatever was happening outside in the darkness was real. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it, to find some kind of logical explanation. Wild animals? Sure, we have coyotes out here, foxes, raccoons, opossums, even sometimes hear a bobcat way off in the distance. But this wasn't anything like that. This wasn't animal noises. These were monstrous noises. And the smell. No animal smells like that. Not even roadkill. This was something else. Then it hit me. Earlier that evening before dinner, I was cleaning out the fridge, and I found some old fruit in the crisper drawer, some apples that were starting to get soft, a couple of peaches that were bruised and squishy. I didn't want to waste them, so I just tossed them out into the yard, thinking maybe the animals would eat them. Just a few yards away from the shed, actually, right where Duke had run to. Could it be that? Did something come to eat the fruit? Something bigger than a raccoon or an opossum? And Duke, did he surprise it? Did he get too close and whatever it was, did it scream at him? And then, whatever those other sounds were, was it fighting over the fruit, fighting with itself? Or with Duke? No, that didn't make sense. Fruit wouldn't attract that. And Duke, he would have come running back right away if it was just a raccoon or something. He's chased off raccoons before. This was different, way different. The screams and growls and whatever those yelps were continued for a while. Maybe 10 minutes? It felt like hours. We just stood there, frozen, listening, smelling, breathing shallow breaths to try to minimize the stench. Mark was practically glued to my side. Duke stayed hidden behind the couch, whimpering. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence again. Complete and utter silence, except for the damn crickets. The smell was still there, but maybe it was starting to fade a little. Or maybe we were just getting used to it. I couldn't tell. We waited. We stood there in the kitchen doorway, not moving, not speaking for, I don't know how long. A long time. 15 minutes? 20? Just silence? Just darkness? Just the awful smell, slowly, subtly fading, or so I hoped. Finally, Mark spoke, his voice still shaky. "Mom, can I sleep in your room tonight?" I nodded. I didn't even hesitate. "Yes, honey. Yes, you can." Because honestly, I didn't want to be alone either, not after that, not tonight. We slowly, cautiously backed away from the kitchen door. keeping our eyes fixed on the darkness outside. We crept into the living room. Duke peeked out from behind the couch, still looking terrified. We coaxed him out, and he came crawling to us, tail still tucked, whimpering. We went upstairs, Duke trailing behind us, sticking close. We locked the bedroom door, even though it felt stupid, like a door would stop. Whatever that was. Mark climbed into bed, still shaking. Duke curled up on the floor beside the bed, still whimpering occasionally. I sat on the edge of the bed, just listening to the silence, listening for anything at all. But there was nothing, just silence, and the faintest hint of that smell, still lingering in the air. We stayed awake for hours, I think, just listening, waiting, dreading for something to happen again, but nothing did. The rest of the night passed in silence, and then, finally, dawn started to break. Slowly, grey light crept into the room. The birds started to chirp, normal bird chirps. It sounded surreal after the night we'd just had. As soon as it was light enough, I crept downstairs, Mark right behind me, Duke glued to our heels. We checked the kitchen, the living room, every room downstairs. Nothing. Everything looked normal, too normal. Then we went outside. Slowly, cautiously, we stepped out into the yard. It was a beautiful morning. The sun was rising, the birds were singing, the dew was sparkling on the grass. It was peaceful, like nothing had happened at all, except for the smell. It was still there, faint but unmistakable, lingering in the air around the shed. We walked over to the shed, slowly, nervously. Duke whimpered and tried to pull back, but we kept going. We got to the shed. Nothing looked disturbed. The door was still closed, just as we always left it. The grass around it was just grass. No footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing broken, nothing unusual, except for the smell. It was stronger here, right by the shed. We didn't open the shed door. I didn't want to. I didn't want to know what, if anything, was inside. We just stood there for a minute, staring at it, breathing in that awful smell, feeling the lingering fear, the cold dread in our guts. And then we went back inside. We locked the door, and we haven't talked about it much since. Not really. We tried to forget it, to pretend it didn't happen, but it did. We both heard it. We both smelled it. Duke definitely heard and smelled it too. He still gets jumpy at night now sometimes, especially if it's really dark out. I have no explanation, none. Was it an animal, something wild? But what kind of animal makes those sounds? What kind of animal smells like that? And what was it doing by our shed in the middle of the night, eating rotting fruit? That doesn't make any sense. I've tried to rationalize it, to find some kind of logical explanation, but I can't. There isn't one. At least not one that makes any sense in the real world. Sometimes, late at night, when it's really quiet and I can't sleep, I still think about it. I still hear those screams in my head. I still smell that smell. And I still get that cold, sick feeling of absolute terror in the pit of my stomach. And I know deep down that whatever it was out there in the dark by the shed that night, it wasn't normal. It wasn't natural, and I really, truly don't ever want to hear it again. Ever. Nasees, Story 14. Man, I still get chills thinking about it, even after all these years. It was summer of '85. Must have been late July or early August, because it was that heavy, humid heat where the air just hangs on you, you know. The kind that makes you sweat the second you step outside. We'd been out fishing at the lake all day, Jaime and me. Bristol Lake over in Morgan County. Nothing special, just trying to catch some bass, mostly just soaking up the quiet and escaping the wives for a bit, to be honest. We packed up our gear as the sun started dipping down. You know, that golden hour when everything gets all hazy and orange. We were tired, a little sunburnt, and ready for some cold beers. Jaime was driving his beat-up old pickup that Ford he'd had since forever. We took Lawrence Road back towards Ponte Alta, just the usual route. Nothing felt off, nothing felt weird at all. Just a normal, hot summer day turning into evening in rural Ohio. Then it happened. We were driving along, and Lawrence Road kinda winds a bit, trees on both sides, fields beyond that. On the left, there's that old cemetery. Been there forever, stones all weathered and crooked, you know the kind. Anyway, Marcelo, that's me by the way, Marcelo Prado. I was just looking out the window, not really thinking about anything, just watching the trees go by and the shadows getting longer. And that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was someone messing around in the graveyard, but it was way back, deeper in, further than anyone would just be hanging out. And it was moving, walking, erect. That's the first thing that struck me, how tall it was, and how it was just walking on two legs, clear as day, back in the cemetery. I didn't say anything for a second. I just kept staring, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It looked big, really big, and dark-colored, like shadowy almost, against the fading light, even though it was still pretty bright out. It was back amongst the older graves, you know, the ones further from the road, near the back fence line of the cemetery. It was moving sort of west, away from the road, but still inside the graveyard. "Jaime," I said, and my voice was a little shaky, even to me. He was humming along to the radio, some country station, and I guess he could tell something was up just by my voice. "Yeah, what's wrong?" he asked, glancing over at me quick. "Stop the truck. Stop the truck now, Jaime," I said, and I pointed out the window with my whole arm, practically. My heart started hammering. I felt this instant jolt of fear, but also confusion, like my brain was scrambling to figure out what it was looking at, but couldn't quite compute. Jaime slammed on the brakes, tires squealing a little on the asphalt, and the truck lurched to a stop. He gave me a look like I was crazy. "What the hell, Marcelo? You see a deer? You okay?" "Look," I said, pointing again, my finger trembling this time. "In the cemetery, back there." He followed my finger, squinting, his brow furrowed. It took him a second, I could tell. He was looking at the headstones, the trees inside the graveyard, probably expecting to see a deer, like he said. Then, I guess he saw it too. His jaw dropped. "Holy!" was all he managed to get out, and then the radio just filled the silence, that cheesy country song suddenly sounding really loud and out of place. He reached over and snapped the radio off without even thinking. We both just stared. The thing was still walking. It was further back now than when I first saw it, probably about 100 yards from the road, maybe even a little more, moving parallel to the road in the back part of the cemetery. We had a pretty good view, though, because the graveyard sloped slightly upwards away from the road, and there weren't too many trees right in that section, and it was still standing up, completely upright. It was definitely tall. Even at that distance, you could tell it was way taller than a person, like way taller. I mean, those old gravestones in that cemetery, some of them are pretty tall, but this thing towered over them. And it was wide, too, broad across the shoulders. We could see its silhouette against the trees beyond the graveyard fence, even though the light was fading more with each minute. As we watched, frozen in the truck, it stopped walking. It turned, slowly, and it seemed to be facing our direction, or maybe just the road. It was hard to tell for sure, but it definitely stopped moving forward and turned towards us. And then it started, coming closer, not running, not even walking fast, but just moving deliberately towards the road, towards where we were parked. That's when the really weird part happened. It didn't keep walking upright. As it got closer, maybe about 50 yards away now, it just lowered itself, not like it was falling or tripping, but like it was intentionally getting lower to the ground, and then it just squatted down, like on its haunches, knees bent, butt near the ground, like a huge, hairy gorilla almost. And it did something else then, something that I will never, ever forget. It bent forward, leaning onto its hands, but not palms down. It put its knuckles on the ground. I swear to God it was like a gorilla walking on its knuckles, but upright, and then squatting like that. And it was facing us still, just staring in our direction. Then it did it. It slammed its knuckles on the ground. Twice. Hard. Boom. Boom. You could almost hear the thud even through the truck windows, even from that distance. It was like a deliberate signal, like it was making a point. And those thuds, they echoed in that still evening air, and they felt heavy, ominous, and then it just stared. It was still squatting, knuckles on the ground, just looking right at the truck, right at us. I don't know how I know it was looking at us, but I did. It was like those eyes. Even at that distance, I could feel them on me, heavy, intense. Jaime and I just sat there, paralyzed. We were both breathing hard, but neither of us said a word. We were both just watching, trying to process, trying to understand, but there was no understanding it. It was alien, completely out of place. The description, Jesus. Even now it's hard to put into words. It was huge. Like Jaime and I both said later, we figured between 8 and 9 feet tall when it was standing fully upright, maybe more. Definitely around 300 pounds or more, just based on the sheer bulk of it. The shoulders, I swear they were as wide as the hood of Jaime's truck. It was massive and powerful looking. The color, that orangutan color is about right, sort of a dark, reddish brown, all covered in hair. Not fur, really, more like coarse, thick hair. And it was everywhere, arms, legs, chest, back, head, covered, except I think its face. I couldn't really make out details of its face from that distance, but it seemed darker, less hairy, more skin-like, and the hair on its arms. Jesus, that was weird too, especially on its forearms. It was longer there, way longer, like tufts or tassels, kind of curly and shaggy, like ornaments almost hanging off its forearms. It sounds crazy even now saying it, but that's what it looked like it had these long, shaggy fringes of hair hanging off its arms. And it definitely wasn't a bear. We know bears. We're from Ohio. We fish and hunt. We see bears. This wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk upright like that, not for long distances. Bears don't squat on their haunches like that. Bears definitely don't have knuckles like that. And bears don't have those eyes. Those eyes, they weren't animal eyes. They felt intelligent, knowing. And there was something else in them too. Something predatory. Like it was sizing us up. Like it was considering something. I don't even want to think about what it might have been considering. After it thumped its knuckles those 2 times, it just kept staring for what felt like forever. Time seemed to slow down. Everything was quiet except for our breathing and the buzzing in my ears. The air felt thick, heavy, like something was pressing down on us. Then slowly, it started to move again. Not towards us this time. It started to move towards some younger trees that were growing closer to the back fence of the cemetery. They were small trees, saplings really, spaced apart. It started walking towards them, still squatting, still on its knuckles mostly, but sometimes shifting to 2 legs for a step or 2, then back down. It reached the first sapling and tried to hide behind it. I'm saying tried because it was so damn huge. It was ridiculous. The sapling was maybe 6, 7 feet tall at best, skinny as anything. This thing was towering over it, its shoulders and back still completely visible, sticking out on either side of the tree trunk. It was like a kid trying to hide behind a broomstick, but it was trying. We could see it reaching out with its hands, those huge, hairy hands, and sort of pushing the branches apart, trying to make a gap to look through. And then it started peering through the branches, peeking, looking at us from behind the skinny tree trunk, parting the branches and then looking out, checking to see if we were still there. It did that over and over, pushing branches aside, peeking out, staring at us, then pulling back a bit, then peeking again. It was like some kind of twisted game of peekaboo, but there was nothing playful about it. It was unsettling as hell. Those eyes peering out from behind the branches, watching us, calculating. It was terrifying in a way I'd never experienced before. Just pure, primal fear. The feeling that we were being watched, hunted almost by something completely unknown, something powerful, something not human. 5 minutes. Jaime and I estimated later, talking about it in hushed tones years later when we finally broke the silence. 5 agonizing minutes. That's how long we sat there in that truck, staring at this thing as it played its bizarre game of hide-and-seek behind those pathetic little trees, peeking out at us. 5 minutes that felt like 5 hours. Every second stretched out, agonizingly slow. Every peek of those eyes from behind the branches sent another jolt of fear through me. I could feel the sweat dripping down my back, even though the evening was cooling down a bit. My hands were clammy, gripping the dashboard so hard my knuckles were white. I could hear Jaime's breathing beside me, shallow and fast. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Jaime," I whispered, my voice cracking. "We gotta go. Now." He didn't say a word. He just nodded slowly, his eyes still glued to the cemetery. He put the truck in drive, slowly, carefully, like he was afraid to make any sudden movements. And then he just pressed the gas pedal, not flooring it, not peeling out, just a steady, smooth acceleration. But we moved. We started moving away from that cemetery, away from that thing. I kept my eyes glued to the rearview mirror for as long as I could. I watched the cemetery get smaller and smaller, watched the trees and the gravestones fade into the distance. I kept expecting to see it burst out from behind the trees, to see it running after us, or something even worse. But nothing. It just stayed there, back in the graveyard, peeking, watching. As we drove away, we didn't say a word for the rest of the drive back to Ponte Alta, not a single word. The silence in the truck was thick, heavy, even more oppressive than the humid air had been. We were both just processing, trying to make sense of what we had seen, knowing deep down that there was no sense to be made. We got back to town, parked the truck at Jaime's place, and just went our separate ways. No, see you later, no, good night. Just silence. We both went home to our wives, went inside, and pretended like nothing had happened. Pretended it was just another hot summer day that was ending. But everything was different. Something had shifted that day. Something had broken. We both knew it. For 10 years we didn't talk about it. Not to anyone, not even to each other, really. Maybe a quick, mumbled, "Remember that night at the cemetery?" Every now and then. But that was it. We buried it. Tried to pretend it never happened. Tried to convince ourselves that it was just our imaginations, stress, heat exhaustion, anything but what we both knew we had seen. Then, 10 years later, we were at some town event, I forget what, and a few beers in, somehow it came up. I don't even remember how it started, but we were talking and we both just broke down and told the story. To a couple of other guys from town, guys we knew pretty well, and they laughed. Of course they laughed. They didn't believe us for a second, called us crazy, drunk, said we'd seen a bear standing on its hind legs or something stupid like that, ridiculed us, and we just shut up. Again, learned our lesson, kept it to ourselves after that, until years later when I ran into that researcher. Guy was looking into, well, weird stuff, unexplained things, out-of-place phenomena, he called it. And somehow our story came out to him. And for the first time, someone actually listened, really listened, didn't laugh, didn't dismiss us. He asked questions, took notes, seemed interested, believed us maybe, or at least considered the possibility. It was a relief, honestly, to finally tell someone who didn't just laugh it off, to finally share that terror, that confusion, that impossible thing we saw. Even after all those years, the memory of it is still so vivid, so real, and so chilling. I still drive down Lawrence Road sometimes. I still pass that cemetery. I never look over, not anymore. I don't want to see it again. I don't want to remember that feeling, that stare, that question in its eyes, peering out from behind those skinny trees. And sometimes late at night when it's quiet and I'm lying in bed, I still hear it. That sound. Boom, boom, those knuckles hitting the ground, and I see those eyes, watching. I don't know what it was we saw that night. I have no explanation. I just know what we experienced, and I know I will never forget it. Never. Story 15. Okay, so I'm still not completely okay. I'm saying this because even after all these years, thinking about it still messes with my head. It happened back in May of 2017. Nice day, I remember that. One of those late spring days where everything feels alive, you know? Not too hot, not too cold, just perfect. I was out on my porch, just relaxing. My son Mark was there, and my granddaughter Lily. She was maybe 7 then, little ball of energy, always running around asking questions. We were just sitting there, kind of enjoying the quiet, letting Lily play in the yard where we could keep an eye on her. My place is, well, it's out there, rural, lots of woods around, and I got a small lake behind the house. More like a big pond, really, but we call it a lake. It's not huge, maybe an acre or so, surrounded by trees and tall grass and reeds, right by the water's edge. It's peaceful, usually. That day started off peaceful anyway. I was just watching Lily chase butterflies or something when I noticed something moving by the lake. Now, my porch faces the back of the house, overlooks the yard, and then the lake, which is a good distance, maybe 100 yards or so from the house, give or take. At first I thought maybe it was just the wind picking up, but the way the reeds were moving wasn't right for wind. It was like something was pushing through them from underneath. I focused in on the reeds at the edge of the water. They were swaying, like violently swaying, and not from the top down, like wind would do. It was like the bottom parts of the reeds, closer to the water level, were being disturbed, but the tops weren't moving as much. It was weird, really weird. You know when something is just off? This was that. I couldn't see what was causing it. Whatever it was below the height of the reeds, which are tall. Some of them got to be 5 feet, maybe more. Whatever was messing with them was lower down, maybe about waist high in the water, if it was in the water. I kept watching, trying to make out what it was. My eyes were straining, trying to see through the reeds, to see what was in there, and then it happened. Just bang! Something big and dark just exploded out of the reeds right at the edge of the lake. It was like something massive had been hiding in there and just decided to stand up. 1 second, nothing but swaying reeds. The next, it was, I don't even know how to describe it right. Big doesn't even cover it. It was huge, like ridiculously huge, and hairy, covered in this thick matted hair, sort of a grayish-brown dirty color. I'd guess it was standing maybe 7, 8 feet tall, maybe even taller. It was hard to judge the height exactly at that distance, but it was way taller than a person. Way taller than any person. The shoulders, those are what really stuck with me. They were enormous, broad, like a bear but wider. And it didn't have a neck. Not that I could see, its head just seemed to sit right on top of those massive shoulders. It was like its head was just plunked, right on there. That's the best way I can put it. Just no neck at all. Thick, hairy shoulders, and then just head. My breath caught in my chest. It was like all the air just got sucked right out of my lungs. I felt cold, instantly cold, and my stomach dropped. Everything just froze. My mind went blank for a second. Just pure, raw terror. I could feel the blood draining out of my face. I know I went white as a ghost. I could feel it in my face, like all the color just drained away. My skin felt clammy. My heart started pounding in my chest, hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would break. Everything around me just kind of faded out. All I could see was that thing by the lake. Mark must have noticed something was wrong with me. He saw my face, I guess. He snapped out of whatever he was doing and looked at me, really looked at me. Dad? Dad, you okay? You look terrible. Are you having a stroke? What's wrong? He was asking me questions, concern all over his face. He thought I was sick, having some kind of medical emergency. He had no idea. He was looking right at me, worried about me, and he didn't even see it. Lily was still playing in the yard, back to the lake, just being a kid, completely oblivious. And Mark, bless his heart, he was focused on me. I couldn't speak. My throat closed up. I tried to say something, to point, to warn him, but nothing came out, just a choked sound. My hand was shaking as I tried to point towards the lake, but my arm felt heavy, like lead. I was just frozen, staring, pointing a shaky finger towards the reeds where it had been. After a second, I managed to croak out, in a voice that didn't even sound like mine. The lake. That's all I could manage. Just those 2 words, raspy and weak. Mark, still thinking I was having a health problem, turned to look where I was pointing. He looked out towards the lake, then back at me, confused. The lake? What about the lake? Dad, are you sure you're all right? He still didn't see anything. Of course he didn't. It was gone. Just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Vanished back into the reeds or the woods or wherever it came from. Just poof, gone. But I had seen it. I know what I saw. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person. It was something else. Something I can't explain. Mark, once he was sure I wasn't immediately collapsing or something, he started to calm down. He was still worried, but he figured maybe I'd just seen a deer and got startled or something. He tried to brush it off, but I could tell he was still concerned. He knows me. He knows I don't get that freaked out by a deer. Come on, Dad. Let's go take a look. Maybe you just saw a big buck or something. Let's walk down there. He was trying to humor me, I think, and maybe reassure himself too. He still hadn't seen anything and probably thought I was just imagining things. Lily stayed on the porch, still playing, thank God. I didn't want her anywhere near that lake right then. We walked down towards the lake, Mark leading the way. As we got closer, I was still scanning the reeds, my heart pounding again. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow made me jump. I was on edge, terrified it would just pop out again. We got to the edge of the lake, right where I'd seen it. Mark started looking around, trying to see what I might have seen. He poked around in the reeds, checked the ground for tracks, anything, nothing, absolutely nothing. It was like it had never been there. No broken branches, no footprints in the mud, nothing disturbed at all except for where the reeds had been swaying, and even that was calming down now, settling back into place. Just normal. Mark shook his head. Dad, I don't see anything. Are you sure you saw something? Maybe it was just a shadow or something playing tricks on your eyes? He was being gentle, trying to be understanding, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. Mark, I know what I saw, I said, my voice still shaky. It wasn't a shadow, it wasn't a deer, it was something else, something big and hairy. I struggled to find the words to describe it without sounding completely insane. It was like a giant, hairy man, but not a man, not like anything I've ever seen before. He looked at me, really looked at me. He could see I was serious. He knows I'm not one to make things up, especially not something like this. He knows I'm a pretty down-to-earth guy. He could see the fear in my eyes was real. Okay, he said slowly. Okay, Dad. I believe you saw something. I don't know what you could have seen, but we'll keep an eye out. Maybe we'll find something later. We searched around the lake a little longer, but found nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing out of the ordinary. We went back to the house, both of us quiet. Lily was still playing, happy as could be, totally unaware of what had just happened or what I thought had happened. That day, we didn't find anything else. We went inside, and I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. Every time I looked out the window towards the lake, I felt a chill run down my spine. I kept replaying it in my head, trying to make sense of it, but there was no sense to be made. It was just unbelievable. Then, about a week later, Mark was down by the lake again, just checking around, I guess. He came back to the house looking thoughtful. He had something in his hand. "Dad, look at this," he said, handing me something wrapped in a leaf. Carefully, he unwrapped it. It was a footprint in the mud, dried and hardened, but not just any footprint. It was small, tiny, really, and barefoot, but not like a human foot. The toes were longer and wider apart, and the whole foot was wider, chunkier for its size. It was definitely not human, and it wasn't from any animal I recognized. "I found it near the edge of the lake, right where you said you saw it," Mark said quietly. "It's small, though, real small." We both looked at the footprint. It was strange, eerie, and unsettling, especially after what I had seen. "Maybe," Mark started slowly, "maybe what you saw wasn't alone. Maybe there was a baby or a young one, playing by the water, disturbing the reeds, and then maybe the bigger one came and got it, like a mother or father." It was a thought, a strange thought, but it kind of made a little sense. Kids play by the water, right? Human kids, animal kids, maybe those kids too. And maybe the big one I saw was a parent, calling it back into the woods or wherever they live. "Parents calling for dinner," Mark had joked, but there was an edge of unease to his humor. After that, things got weirder. I started hearing things at night, strange sounds coming from the woods around the lake. Not animal sounds I recognized, more like howls, long, drawn-out howls. They were unsettling. They reminded me of something I'd heard about years ago, some recording of a sound called the Ohio Howl. This was similar, creepy and unearthly. We started finding other things too. Broken trees in the woods behind the lake, not just snapped branches, but whole trees twisted and broken like something huge and strong had just ripped them apart. And nests, big, messy nests made of branches and leaves high up in the trees. Way too big for any bird I knew of. And then there was the porch thing. Mark's friends came over one winter before all this happened. They were hanging out on the porch, just talking, and they found footprints in the snow. Big, barefoot footprints right there on my porch. Huge prints like nothing they'd ever seen. They even took pictures.